I'm a 30-year-old woman, and for as long as I can remember, my younger sister Olivia has been the family favorite. Growing up, our parents compared everything: grades, clothes, friends, but it became worse when we became adults. I focused on my architecture career while Olivia married Derek, a startup founder. Overnight, she became the perfect daughter, and family gatherings turned into highlight reels of her new house, travels, and dinners with important people. I didn't mind the praise at first, but when every conversation started with, "Olivia and Derek just bought," or "Olivia's planning another party," I stopped sharing anything about my work. During one dinner, Olivia joked that I was married to my blueprints. Everyone laughed, and I smiled along, though the remark stuck in the air. When she invited me for the holidays at her new home, I accepted, thinking it would be a nice change. Her house was spotless, perfectly staged, and smelled like designer candles. She made sure I noticed every detail. Every comment from her felt like a gentle jab: how peaceful it was to have someone to come home to, how quiet my apartment must be, how I'd understand real joy once I had someone like Derek. That evening, Derek and I ended up talking while she was setting the table. He asked about one of my recent projects, mentioning how much he admired people who built things from scratch. His tone was polite, but the compliment didn't go unnoticed. When I came down the next morning, Olivia's attitude had shifted. She cut him off whenever he tried to speak and acted as if she was hosting a stranger, not her sister. A few days after I left, she called, accusing me of flirting with Derek and being jealous of her marriage. The accusation caught me off guard. I denied it once, calmly, but when she pushed again, I told her to believe what she wanted and ended the call. From that day on, I stayed silent. She could keep her story and her perfect life. I didn't care enough to fix her narrative. Weeks later, while I was reviewing client plans one morning, my phone rang. It was Derek. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was a pocket dial, but he spoke quickly, asking for professional help. Something about a renovation budget that had gone sideways. I hesitated. It sounded like work I could easily do, but the situation felt complicated. Still, his tone was desperate, not flirtatious or familiar. He mentioned he'd tried to manage things himself, but it was falling apart. I agreed on one condition: we'd keep it strictly professional. No family talk, no personal conversation, just numbers, plans, and invoices. The moment I hung up, I realized that whether I liked it or not, Olivia's perfect world was starting to crack, and somehow I was about to be pulled right into the middle of it. The next morning after Derek's call, I drove to the property he mentioned. It was a large 2-story home still surrounded by construction fencing. The driveway was filled with delivery trucks and discarded tiles stacked near the front porch. Derek met me at the door looking exhausted. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and there were papers scattered across the kitchen island. He explained that the renovation had doubled in cost and several contractors were demanding early payments. He handed me a folder filled with invoices and receipts. I noticed 3 different design companies listed for the same living room layout, all charging overlapping fees. The building permits were incomplete, and the city inspection form was unsigned. While I walked through the house, half the kitchen stood unfinished. The backyard deck had been started twice, and several materials still hadn't arrived. Derek followed behind quietly, scribbling notes. When I asked about the missing signatures, he said Olivia had been handling the payments herself. She had insisted on marble countertops imported from Italy and custom fixtures that were still stuck in shipping. I took pictures of every issue, then sat at the dining table with my laptop to calculate a new plan. I drafted a report listing where money had been lost and what steps could fix it. Derek leaned on the counter, rubbing his forehead, saying the project was supposed to be their dream home. I reminded him that every project could be salvaged if handled properly. Halfway through our discussion, the front door opened. Olivia's voice carried through the hall before she appeared, dressed like she was hosting a magazine shoot instead of walking into a construction site. The moment her eyes landed on me, her smile froze. She asked why I was there, glancing between us. Derek started to explain, but she cut him off and said it wasn't necessary, that she already had a designer and didn't need outside interference. She walked around the room, pretending to inspect my notes. Then she made a joke about me, finally seeing what a real home looks like, laughing just loud enough for the workers nearby to hear. Derek tried to redirect the conversation back to the permits, but she kept interrupting until I quietly closed my folder. I told Derek I'd email the report and stepped outside before things turned ugly. That evening, I sent him the full breakdown, every duplicated charge, every delayed shipment, and the contact information for reliable contractors who could finish the job correctly. My message was short and professional. I didn't expect a reply, but an hour later, an email arrived. It was a simple thank you and a request for 2 of the contractor numbers I had mentioned. By the end of the week, the new team had taken over the site. Olivia stopped posting her usual updates and instead shared vague quotes online about jealous people pretending to help. I didn't comment. Our mother called soon after, her tone gentle but pointed. She told me Olivia felt crowded and that maybe I should let her handle her own marriage. I explained that Derek had reached out to me, not the other way around, and that the job was finished. She paused before changing the subject, clearly uncomfortable. Over the next several days, Derek's messages became shorter. He only wrote about inspection dates and invoices, never anything personal. One afternoon, he called to confirm that all permits had been approved. Before hanging up, he went quiet for a moment. Then he said, almost to himself, that I might have been right about what was really broken. I didn't ask what he meant. I saved my files, closed the folder, and moved on to the next client. But the silence that followed told me more than any explanation could. A few weeks after the renovation meeting, Derek sent a short update through email. He had replaced the contractors and fixed the permits using my recommendations. The renovation was back on schedule, and he said the house might finally be finished before summer. I replied with a short acknowledgement and marked the project as closed. After that, Olivia disappeared from family chats. She stopped replying to messages and skipped Sunday calls, claiming she was too busy or tired. Our mother mentioned that she'd sounded distracted on the phone, repeating the same stories but forgetting details halfway through. It wasn't unusual for Olivia to be dramatic, but the silence felt heavier than usual. One afternoon, a cousin called to gossip about a charity gala. Olivia and Derek had attended together, and according to witnesses, the night ended with an argument near the valet station. It started over something small, but the cousin overheard Derek saying he was tired of outsiders interfering in his marriage. The remark spread fast. Within a day, 3 relatives texted me, asking if it was about me. I didn't reply to any of them. A week later, Derek stopped by my office unexpectedly. He looked different, neater, calmer, but with the kind of tiredness that doesn't come from work. He placed an envelope on my desk with a check for the remaining consulting fee. We kept the exchange short. Before he left, he paused at the door and said I was easier to talk to than most people he'd worked with. Then he caught himself, muttered an apology, and left. I sent him a polite message confirming the payment was received and closed the file. That was supposed to be the end of it. A few days later, my phone rang while I was reviewing blueprints. It was Olivia. I almost ignored it, but she called again immediately. When I answered, her tone was sharp. She demanded to know if I'd been meeting Derek behind her back. I told her about the payment and reminded her that the work had been finished for weeks. She accused me of encouraging him to speak against her, claiming I'd made him see things differently. I explained that Derek had hired me for professional help and that I had no interest in her marriage. She didn't care. Her words turned into threats about making sure everyone knew what I'd really done. The call ended abruptly. That night, our father called. He said Olivia had told him I was interfering. He asked for my version, and I told him exactly what happened. He believed me right away. He'd always known how Olivia exaggerated when cornered. Our mother, however, tried to calm things down, saying both of us should stop dragging the family into it. In the days that followed, Olivia's social media posts became erratic. One hour, she'd post pictures of her and Derek smiling at dinner. The next, the same photos would vanish. Then came long captions about loyalty and betrayal, followed by another disappearance. Late one night, my phone lit up with a single message from Derek. It read, "Thank you for staying professional. Things are unraveling fast." I stared at it for a moment, then deleted the thread without replying. The next morning, a new message arrived from Olivia. It was short, written in the same dramatic way she used when we were kids. It said, "You've ruined everything." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The damage she was talking about had already started long before I stepped in. After Olivia's message accusing me of ruining everything, I didn't hear from either of them for days. Family chats were quiet. Even my parents avoided mentioning her name. A week later, while I was finalizing drawings for another client, an email from Derek appeared in my inbox. It was brief and professional. He asked to meet at my office to discuss a matter involving the property. I assumed it was about invoices or paperwork, so I set a time during office hours. When he arrived, he looked like he hadn't slept much. His usual sharp look was replaced by rumpled clothes and a distracted expression. He placed a folder on the desk and said he planned to sell the house. He explained that the debts tied to it had become too heavy. Olivia had taken private loans using his name, claiming they were for finishing touches, but the money had gone toward parties, luxury furniture, and expensive trips she never paid off. He said he discovered the loans when a lender called his office demanding payment. By then, interest had ballooned, and several accounts were overdue. He said he had moved into the guest room weeks ago, The house had started to feel like a museum, perfect in photos, hollow in reality. He wanted to cut his losses before the bank stepped in. I told him I could refer him to 2 real estate agents and a financial advisor who could handle the sale quickly. I gave him their contacts, printed a few copies of relevant documents, and kept the meeting short. That night, around 9, I heard loud knocking on my apartment door. When I opened it, Olivia stood there, eyes red, holding her phone like she was ready to record. She demanded to know why Derek had come to see me and accused me of encouraging him to sell the house. I told her he'd scheduled a professional meeting and that it wasn't my business what he decided about his home. She paced in front of my doorway, talking fast, saying I'd always wanted to take her place, that Derek trusted me more than her. I stood still and told her she needed to leave before the neighbors called security. She didn't stop. Her tone shifted from rage to desperation, her words tumbling over each other. When she finally paused, I said clearly that I wouldn't be involved in her marriage anymore. I closed the door while she was still talking in the hallway. An hour later, our mother called. She said Olivia was upset, claiming Derek confided in me about personal things. I explained I hadn't seen him outside work, and that the only conversation we'd had was about selling his property. She sighed and said she didn't want to take sides, but I could tell Olivia had already fed her version of the story. By the weekend, whispers began spreading through family circles. Someone mentioned that Derek and Olivia's house was on the market. The listing didn't use their names, but the photos gave it away. The marble counters, the open staircase, the oversized chandelier she once bragged about. A few days later, a local society blog posted photos from a business fundraiser. Derek was there, standing beside a few colleagues. Olivia was nowhere in sight. The caption mentioned the founder appearing solo for the first time. That was the moment I knew their image. The one she'd spent years polishing had started to collapse in public, and I didn't need to say a single word for everyone to see it happening. A few days after Derek's solo appearance at the fundraiser, my parents came to visit me. They looked uneasy, speaking in low tones, even though no one else was around. My mother said Olivia had been canceling appointments, skipping lunches she had planned, and sending confusing messages to relatives. She'd tell one cousin she was moving to another city, and another that she and Derek were reconciling. My father admitted he'd tried calling Derek himself, but Derek hadn't answered. 2 days later, I heard another knock at my door. It was late evening, and when I opened it, Olivia stood there again. But this time she wasn't furious. She looked small, like she hadn't slept in days. Her hands shook as she held her phone. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside and sat down at the kitchen table. She asked if I'd known it would end like this. I told her I didn't know anything except that Derek had seemed tired for a long time. She started pacing, saying Derek's pride couldn't handle her success, that he was intimidated by how well she managed things. But as she talked, the story began to break apart. Her words slowed down, and she finally admitted Derek had found several credit cards opened under his company's name. She'd been using them for vacations, new clothes, even the marble shipment that had caused the delays. When Derek confronted her, she said she tried to explain that it was temporary, that she planned to fix it once his next investment paid off. He didn't listen. She shouted. He shouted back, and in the middle of it, she grabbed his laptop and smashed it on the floor. That was when he packed a bag and left. My parents had tried to reach him afterward. My father even went to his office, but Derek refused to meet. He told one of his assistants to tell my father that he was done negotiating with denial. The next day, Olivia sent out invitations for a family dinner. She told everyone it was to celebrate a new beginning. I almost didn't go, but curiosity got the better of me. The dinner was awkward from the start. Olivia had gone overboard with decorations, flowers, candles, and a printed seating chart. Derek arrived late, wearing a neutral expression. He greeted everyone politely but didn't touch her hand when she tried to guide him to the table. Throughout the meal, she kept smiling, asking exaggerated questions and laughing at things no one found funny. When a cousin asked about Derek's business expansion, she jumped in, boasting that they were thriving more than ever. Derek set down his glass and said calmly that they'd actually had to start laying off staff due to mismanagement. The table went silent. Someone tried to change the subject, but the tension had already shifted. Olivia's smile stayed frozen, her fork clinking against her plate. Within minutes, guests began finding excuses to leave. By the end of the night, the perfect image she'd spent years polishing had cracked in front of everyone. After the last person left, Olivia stood in the middle of the room, staring at the untouched dessert table. She finally said she didn't know who she was without people admiring her. I told her quietly that rebuilding meant being honest first, not pretending harder. She didn't answer. When I started cleaning up, she followed me to the guest room and asked if she could stay the night. I agreed. Later, as I was turning off the lights, she spoke from the doorway. She said Derek was already talking to someone else. For clarity, she called it. I remembered Derek's tired voice weeks earlier. The way he'd said things were broken. It didn't sound like betrayal. It sounded like someone who had finally reached his limit. When I woke up the next morning, Olivia was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. Her coffee had gone cold. She didn't look up until she spoke, saying Derek had sent her an email. She handed me the phone without a word. The email was short, formal, and final. He had filed for divorce. Attached were bank records, copies of the company credit card statements, and screenshots of messages between her and a lender. It wasn't anger, it was documentation. She stayed quiet for a long time after that. Then, like a floodgate opening, she started talking about everything she had done to keep the image of their life alive. The designer trips she posted about had been partially borrowed, the lavish dinners often paid on credit. She said she had wanted everyone, especially our parents, to think she was thriving. I didn't interrupt. She needed to talk, not to be consoled. Around noon, she started calling Derek. Each attempt went to voicemail. She tried his office, but his assistant said he wasn't available and asked that future calls go through his lawyer. Olivia hung up, her hands shaking. A few minutes later, she opened her laptop and began drafting a long post about fake loyalty and marriages built on betrayal, but deleted it halfway through. Our parents arrived that evening. Our father sat beside her, reading the printed divorce documents in silence. Our mother tried to say it was just a fight that could be fixed until she saw the evidence of the accounts and the loan agreements in Derek's name. For the first time, she didn't defend Olivia. She folded the papers and told her she had gone too far. Over the next few days, Olivia moved between anger and exhaustion. She stayed with me temporarily, sleeping late and leaving her phone on silent. Derek, meanwhile, finalized the house sale with one of the agents I had referred earlier. The transaction went through faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks, the perfect home she'd once bragged about was no longer theirs. When the official notice came, Olivia packed a few boxes and rented a small apartment on the city's edge. She said she needed space. Our mother visited her once and came back teary-eyed, saying Olivia was living quietly, barely speaking, and spending hours writing notes that she never mailed. A month later, Derek called my office. His tone was steady, businesslike. He thanked me again for maintaining boundaries and said the paperwork for the sale was complete. He added that he wanted to clear any remaining financial ties with Olivia before closing accounts. I told him I appreciated the update and that our professional connection was over. That was the last time we spoke. After Derek's call, Olivia reached out again. She showed up outside my office during lunch, saying Derek had told her I'd been helpful. She looked uneasy, like she wanted a fight, but couldn't find the words. Instead, she asked if I thought he would come back. I told her that wasn't my question to answer. She nodded, then said she was sorry for dragging me into everything. She left before I could respond. Weeks passed quietly. Family gatherings returned to normal, though Olivia didn't attend. Our parents mentioned she had started freelance work. Small projects, nothing extravagant. Every now and then, I'd hear from mutual friends that she kept mostly to herself, no longer posting the curated updates she used to flood everyone with. Then one afternoon, a plain white envelope arrived at my office with no return address. Inside was a short note written in Olivia's familiar handwriting. He's asking for advice again. Should I answer? I didn't call her. I didn't ask what she meant. Whether Derek had reached out about work, closure, or something else, I knew stepping back had been the only thing keeping peace intact. I folded the letter and put it away in my desk drawer. By the end of that year, the entire story of Olivia and Derek had become a whisper in family conversations, a cautionary tale about pride and performance. Our parents stopped comparing us, realizing too late how their constant praise of appearances had helped fuel her obsession with perfection. I focused on my projects, rebuilding my schedule and closing the last files connected to Derek's former company. Sometimes, when clients asked for design recommendations, I caught myself avoiding the kind of grandeur Olivia used to chase. I preferred simple, clean lines, things that lasted. Months later, I learned through a colleague that Olivia had moved again, to another city entirely. She'd taken a new job with a small interior design firm, starting over quietly. I didn't reach out. There was nothing left to fix between us. The last time I saw her name was on a holiday card she sent our parents. It was signed only with her first name, no return address, just a short message that said, "Learning peace." I never heard from Derek again either. The last update about him came from a news article about his company restructuring under new leadership. He had sold his shares and stepped away completely. Looking back, it felt strange how something that started as a renovation project turned into the unraveling of an entire marriage, and in some ways, a family dynamic that had been broken for years. I didn't cause it, but being near it showed me how fragile appearances can be when they're built on borrowed ground. By the time spring arrived, I had cleared out my desk and found the old note Olivia had sent, the one about Derek asking for advice. I read it once more, then placed it back in the drawer without answering. Some doors, I realized, were better left closed. When I first read the note that said, "He's asking for advice again. Should I answer?" I recognized the handwriting immediately. Olivia hadn't signed it, but the slant of her letters and the way she looped her Y gave it away. I folded it once and placed it back in the envelope. There was nothing to answer. Some things didn't need to be reopened. I locked the note inside my desk drawer and went back to work. Weeks passed quietly. Family conversations mentioned that Olivia had moved back into the city. She'd rented a small apartment near the art district, kept to herself, and skipped every family dinner. Our mother said she'd seen her once walking out of a library with a backpack instead of her usual handbag. She looked thinner, calmer, older. No one really knew what she was doing, and for the first time, no one tried to guess. One morning, my assistant told me a man had called the office asking for a final report on the property sale I'd handled last year. It was Derek. His message was short and formal, requesting a statement for the closing file. I asked my assistant to prepare it and send it directly. There was no need for me to speak to him personally. By the end of that week, I heard through my father that the divorce had been finalized. Derek had kept his company, and Olivia had received her share of the settlement. No drama, no announcements, just signatures and silence. About a month later, I stopped by a small cafe downtown after a meeting. While waiting for my order, I noticed someone sitting near the window. It took a moment to realize it was Olivia. Her hair was shorter, her clothes simple. She was writing in a small notebook with a pencil, no jewelry, no phone on the table. I considered leaving without saying anything, but she looked up and met my eyes before I could turn away. She smiled faintly and waved me over. I walked to her table, and we talked for the first time in nearly a year. Her tone was different, steady, polite, almost quiet. She thanked me for never using her downfall against her, for not telling everyone how bad things had gotten. I told her there had never been anything to gain from exposing her. I just wanted peace. She nodded, saying she finally understood that the rivalry had only ever existed in her mind. After a moment, she mentioned Derek. She said he had called her once, not to reconcile, but to say goodbye properly. He told her that he respected how I had stayed neutral through everything. Then she added, almost like a confession, that he had told her I never made chaos out of truth. The line hung between us for a while. For the first time, our conversation wasn't a performance. She didn't defend, justify, or compare. She told me she had started evening design classes at a local community center. The work wasn't glamorous, but she liked learning again. She said she was practicing living without needing an audience. I listened quietly, watching how her voice didn't tremble anymore. Before she left, she pulled a small white envelope from her bag and placed it on the table. Inside was a check for the consulting work I had done during the renovation, the same payment Derek had tried to give her years ago. She said it was time to close every open tab between us. I didn't argue. I accepted it and told her I hoped she'd find something real to build this time. She smiled, thanked me, and walked out. Months passed without another word. One afternoon, a friend mentioned seeing Olivia's name in a local design newsletter. She had moved to another city to work on small interior projects for a housing firm. No photos, no interviews, just her name listed quietly among the staff. I didn't try to contact her. There wasn't anything left to fix. She had finally stepped away from the life she'd been performing for so long. When I think about everything now, the comparisons, the accusations, the years of tension, it all feels like a different lifetime. The story didn't end in dramatic closure or some big emotional speech. It just faded out naturally, replaced by quiet understanding. Olivia found a new start, and I found peace in distance. For the first time, our lives weren't competing stories anymore. They were simply separate ones, each moving forward without needing to prove anything. And that, more than anything, felt like the real ending. I'm a 32-year-old nurse, married to Daniel, who's 34 and works as an accountant. After 7 years of apartment living and saving every spare dollar, we finally bought our first home, a small 2-story place just outside the city. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. We spent the first night surrounded by half-open boxes and takeout containers, laughing about how we didn't even own a proper dining table yet. For the first time, it felt like we could make decisions without anyone's opinion hanging over us. That feeling lasted about 48 hours. Before we'd even unpacked the dishes, Daniel's mother called. Patricia is 62, sharp-tongued, and proud of the fact that her traditional values made Daniel who he is. She didn't ask if she could come see the new place. She announced that she'd stop by to inspect it and give some seasoned advice. Daniel hesitated, but saying no to her always meant days of guilt-ridden silence, so he agreed. The next morning, Patricia arrived carrying a notepad and a critical stare. She walked through the living room like an appraiser, tapping her finger on the mantel and muttering about modern clutter. The curtains were too dark, the sofa oddly placed, and apparently our color palette lacked warmth. She adjusted picture frames, opened cabinets, and even reorganized our spice rack mid-conversation, calling it helping us build good habits early. That night we made dinner, something simple, and she used it as an opportunity for a lecture. While Daniel and I ate, she listed the rules she'd lived by when raising him. No shoes inside, chores before television, and dinner exactly at 6 every evening. She said structure was what made a home civilized. Daniel smiled weakly and focused on his plate. I noticed how he barely spoke when she was around, as if years of practice had taught him that silence kept the peace. Her visits became routine after that. She'd drop by every few days with excuses, to fold laundry, to wipe a counter, or to check if we needed help arranging our pantry. She'd open the refrigerator, frown at my choice of yogurt, and comment that I must be busy if I didn't have time to keep things organized. It reached a point where I couldn't leave a drawer closed without wondering if she'd open it the next day. One afternoon, I came home to find her rearranging our kitchen shelves again. I told her gently that I preferred things a certain way and asked her to stop. She looked at me as if I'd just spoken another language. When Daniel got home, he tried to calm things down, saying she just means well, which somehow made it worse. That night, instead of arguing, I printed a small sign and hung it by the front door. It read, "House rules, call before visiting, respect our space, no rearranging items." The next time Patricia came over, she spotted it instantly. Her face went red. She accused me of humiliating her in her son's own home, and stormed out, muttering that I was treating her like a child. A few days later, at a family dinner, she made a pointed comment about younger women not understanding respect for their elders while staring straight at me. On the drive home, Daniel finally admitted he was tired of the constant tension, but asked me not to make him choose sides. I didn't answer. I just looked out the window, already forming an idea. If Patricia believed her rules made a home civilized, maybe it was time she experienced what living by them actually felt like. 2 weeks after that dinner, Patricia called out of nowhere. She said her house's plumbing had burst and that she'd need to stay for a week. Her tone wasn't a request. It was the kind that expected an immediate yes. Daniel didn't even pause before agreeing. "She's family," he said, already checking which room she could use. I didn't argue. If anything, it felt like the perfect setup for what I'd quietly planned since that night in the car. Patricia arrived the next morning with 2 large suitcases, a toolbox, a stack of cleaning gloves, and her own pantry labels. She moved through the house like a home inspector, opening cupboards and mumbling about improving efficiency. Within hours, she'd changed the thermostat, replaced my detergent with hers, and left notes on the counter about proper folding technique. Daniel kept glancing at me, waiting for me to lose patience, but I just smiled. That evening, as I was cleaning the kitchen, I remembered something Daniel once mentioned. His mother used to have a house rule book when he was a kid. She'd written down every rule from bedtime to chores, laminated it and taped it to the fridge. Daniel laughed when he told the story, but that night I decided it was time to bring it back. The next day, I called Daniel's sister Laura to ask if she remembered it. She didn't just remember, she still had a copy. Within minutes, she sent me photos of every page. "Please tell me you're not about to do what I think you're about to do," she said between laughs. I thanked her and started typing. I printed Patricia's rules word for word and hung them on the fridge under the title Patricia's Proven Household Rules. Every single one, from chores before leisure to dinner ends at 6 sharp. Even no unnecessary electricity use past sunset. I made sure it looked neat, laminated, and official. That evening while setting the table, I brought it up as casually as I could. I told Patricia we thought it'd be fun to follow her old rules while she was staying with us. Since they worked so well when you raised Daniel, we figured we could all live by them for the week. She looked from the paper to me, lips pressed tight, unsure whether to feel honored or insulted. Daniel tried to focus on his food. The next morning, I started early. At 6 a.m., I knocked on her guest room door with a bright, cheerful voice. "Rise and shine. Morning chores start early. Remember your rule. The day begins with discipline." She opened the door, hair in curlers, completely bewildered. By breakfast, she was muttering about coffee being too bitter, but I just reminded her of her own words. Breakfast first, complaints later. She blinked like she wasn't sure if I was serious. Later that afternoon, Patricia tried to snack before dinner. I quietly took the plate and reminded her, kitchen closes after 6. She looked stunned but said nothing. That evening, when she left her dishes in the sink, I stood beside her with a smile and said, "You always said dishes should be washed right away. Wouldn't want to break your own rule." Daniel nearly choked, trying not to laugh. The next few days became a rhythm. Patricia tried to bend her own rules, but I enforced every one, gently, politely, word for word. She tried to leave the lights on after sunset. I reminded her of her energy-saving rule. She tried to stay up late watching TV. I pointed to the bedtime by 10 section. Every correction was served with perfect courtesy, the kind she always claimed to value. By midweek, the house had gone silent. Patricia still followed the schedule, but moved slower now, like someone realizing the weight of their own habits. One afternoon, she tried to vent to Daniel about how these rules were meant for children, but he just said, "They were your rules, Mom." She didn't respond. That night, she skipped dessert and went to bed early. When I checked the kitchen later, the counters were spotless, and her laundry was folded neatly. On the fridge, the list still hung perfectly in place, and next to it, she had taped a small sticky note that simply read, "Consistency builds character." By the end of the week, Patricia was quiet, almost thoughtful. She packed her things without comment, double-checked that she'd left the guest room tidy, and placed her old laminated list on the counter. "These rules were for kids," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. I smiled and thanked her for following them so well. Daniel drove her home that afternoon, and when he came back, he stood in the doorway, half amused and half stunned. "I think you broke her," he said. I shook my head. "No," I told him. "I think she finally saw what living by her own standards really feels like." For the first time since we'd moved in, the house felt completely still. No rearranged cabinets, no surprise visits, no judgment lingering in the air, just silence, finally earned through structure. Patricia herself had written, and for once she couldn't argue with it. A few days after Patricia went home, Daniel and I finally had a weekend to ourselves. We cleaned, cooked dinner together, and enjoyed the silence that had been missing for weeks. But by midweek, the peace started cracking. Patricia began calling Daniel again, this time to clarify that her rules weren't meant to be followed. So literally, she said they were guidelines, not strict laws. Daniel didn't say much, just raised an eyebrow at me. I told him we'd still respect her system exactly as written. That Friday, she came over unannounced just to check on things. I greeted her with a polite smile, motioned toward the printed Patricia's proven household rules still hanging on the fridge, and told her we were keeping up with them perfectly. Her expression froze. It was clear she'd expected me to drop it after her departure. That evening, she stayed for dinner. I told her we'd eat at 6 sharp, like her list said. But she took her time setting the table, and didn't sit down until nearly 7. Without a word, I poured myself a bowl of cereal and started eating. Daniel followed my lead. Patricia's fork hovered midair. She asked if we were skipping her dinner, and I just pointed to the clock and smiled. Kitchen closes at 6. The next morning, the tension shifted. She refused to help with the laundry, saying it wasn't her chore day. I reminded her that according to her own rules, everyone contributes equally. She rolled her eyes but eventually folded a load of towels. Not well, but folded. The following day, she tried a different tactic. While Daniel was at work, Patricia invited one of her friends over without calling first. I met the woman at the door, offered her coffee, and kept the entire visit on the porch. When Patricia asked why we weren't going inside, I simply said, "We ask visitors to call first." The woman gave a sympathetic smile, clearly understanding what was happening. That night, Patricia tried one more act of rebellion. She turned the thermostat down several degrees before bed, muttering about how a cool house builds character. I just added an extra blanket to her room and reminded her that we save energy here. Your rule, remember? 2 days later, I was tidying the guest room when I found crumbs under her pillow. I didn't make a scene. I just changed the sheets and left a note on her nightstand. No food outside the dining area. House Rule 9. Later that afternoon, her friend called while I was nearby. Patricia whispered into the phone that she was under strict house rules and couldn't talk long. The irony didn't miss me. That weekend, Daniel's sister stopped by. She spotted the rule sheet and burst out laughing. "She's living her own childhood again," she joked. Patricia glared at her, but didn't deny it. Something began to shift after that. Patricia still grumbled, but started cleaning without reminders. She stopped touching the thermostat. The lights stayed off after sunset. For the first time, she asked before moving anything in the kitchen. At dinner one night, she commented that my enforcement was a bit strict. I smiled and said that respect starts with example. Daniel, without hesitation, looked at his mother and said, "These are your rules. Mom, you always said structure matters." She didn't answer. The house went quiet that evening. Patricia ate dinner alone in the guest room, and when I passed by later, the door was closed but the light was still on. It stayed that way for a long time. The next morning, she came into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. For the first time since her arrival, she knocked. I looked up from the stove, and she smiled slightly before thanking me for breakfast. By the weekend, she announced she'd be leaving soon to give us our space. Her tone was calm, almost reflective. I told her we'd be happy to drive her home. She nodded and said that wouldn't be necessary. She'd already arranged a ride. When she left, I noticed she'd taken the printed list from the fridge. In its place, she'd left a folded note that simply read, "You run a disciplined home. I see where Daniel gets it from." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the first sign that she finally understood what she'd been putting us through. As the door closed behind her, the quiet that filled the house wasn't tense this time, it was earned. Patricia moved back to her own house just like she said she would. She called it needing her space again, though everyone could tell it was pride talking. She left quietly, with the same stiffness she carried whenever she felt outmatched. For the first time in months, the house was completely ours again. The silence that followed felt like real peace. No rearranged shelves, no commentary on our habits, no tension simmering in every corner. Weeks passed smoothly. Daniel and I started hosting small dinners with friends, cooking new recipes, and catching up on rest. It felt like we'd reclaimed our home, but peace with Patricia never lasted long. The first cracks showed up through Daniel's sister, Laura. She mentioned during a call that Patricia had been explaining her side to relatives, saying I'd twisted her household traditions and made her look foolish. According to Patricia, she had only been helping and I'd turned her rules into a power game. She never said these things directly to me, always through others. A week later, I ran into one of Patricia's friends at the grocery store. The woman smiled politely but added, almost in passing, that Patricia had been hurt by how she was treated, and that a mother should be respected in her son's home. I just nodded, finished shopping, and left without comment. Daniel heard about it too. He didn't defend her words, but it clearly bothered him. He said he hated the whispers and wished she'd just drop it. I told him to let it be. Her stories would wear thin eventually. Instead of engaging, I focused on something small but symbolic. We'd had a few old furniture pieces Patricia once called cheap-looking. I donated them to a local family who had just moved into their first apartment. When Daniel told his mom about it later, she didn't say anything, but word must have spread. A few days later, Patricia called to invite us to dinner at her place. Her tone was polite but tight, the kind that sounds more like a challenge than an invitation. When we arrived, her house looked exactly like it had years ago. Spotless, symmetrical, and cold. The dining table was set with her old lace cloth, crystal bowls, and formal napkin rings. She had even placed name cards at each seat, labeling where Daniel and I were to sit. Just like old times, she said as we took our spots. Dinner began smoothly. She asked about work, complimented the meal, and acted as though the past few months hadn't happened. But halfway through, old habits crept in. Daniel reached for seconds before everyone had finished, and Patricia immediately stopped mid-sentence to correct him.
You know the rule,
she said sharply. No one takes more until everyone's done. Daniel froze. I looked at her calmly and said, I thought those rules were retired. You said adults don't need them. The silence that followed was heavy. For a moment, Patricia's eyes darted between us. She tried to recover by changing the subject, but Daniel spoke up. His tone was steady. Mom, we're adults now. We live differently. She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the perfectly set table like she was trying to find something to hold on to. The rest of dinner was quiet. When we got up to leave, she thanked us quickly but avoided meeting my eyes. On the drive home, Daniel laughed under his breath and said, That's the first dinner I didn't feel like a kid. I just nodded. Later that night, I imagined Patricia sitting in that same dining room, surrounded by her perfect dishes and spotless counters, realizing how empty it all must have felt without control to fill the air. The next morning, Daniel showed me a text from her. It only said, Thank you for coming. I'm thinking about a few things. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first time she'd ever admitted, even indirectly, that she might need to. A few weeks after that dinner, Patricia started acting different. It began with small, almost awkward gestures, text messages about the weather, a recipe she'd found, or a picture of her garden. They were short and polite, nothing like her usual controlling tone. I replied kindly each time, keeping my answers simple. Experience had taught me that her attempts at change often came with hidden strings attached. Then Daniel's sister, Laura, invited the whole family to her birthday dinner. She promised it would be relaxed, no speeches, no tension. Patricia confirmed she'd come and even said she wanted it to be a drama-free evening. I didn't fully believe her, but I agreed to go. The night started off surprisingly pleasant. Laura's living room buzzed with laughter, kids running around, music in the background. Patricia arrived in a calm mood, greeting everyone warmly, even complimenting Laura's new curtains. She stayed quiet during small talk and seemed to be making an effort to blend in. Daniel leaned over once and whispered that she was actually behaving. It didn't last long. Midway through dessert, one of Laura's kids accidentally dropped a slice of chocolate cake onto the carpet. Patricia's reaction was instant. She stood up, ready to scold, her finger already pointing. Then her eyes met mine. I didn't say anything, just looked at her. Something in her shifted. She took a deep breath, forced a small smile, and said, "Accidents happen." The room, which had frozen for a second, instantly relaxed. Laura looked shocked, then grateful. Later, when we were cleaning up, she quietly told me she'd never seen her mother stop herself mid-lecture before. I just shrugged and helped wipe up the frosting. The next morning, Daniel got a call. Patricia had slipped on her kitchen floor and bruised her leg. Her voice sounded shaky but insistent that she was fine. We drove over anyway. She tried to brush it off, saying she didn't need help, but she was clearly in pain. As a nurse, I couldn't ignore it. I checked her leg, wrapped it properly, and made sure she could walk safely. She sat on the couch with an ice pack, uncharacteristically quiet. Then she muttered that she hated feeling useless. I told her she wasn't useless, she just wasn't in charge right now. For once, she didn't argue. The next few days, I stopped by after work to bring her food and make sure the bruise wasn't getting worse. She never asked, but she didn't resist either. Instead of instructing me on how to do things, she started asking gentle questions about my work shifts, about Daniel's job, even about the new curtains in our living room. When she cooked, she'd ask for my opinion on seasoning instead of telling me how it should taste. One afternoon, while I was tidying up her kitchen, she told me about her younger days, how she ran her house when Daniel and Laura were little, how proud she'd been that everything was always perfect. She said it almost wistfully, like she was realizing what that perfection had cost. By the end of the week, her leg had improved. On my last visit before she started walking on her own again, she followed me to the door. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "You run your house beautifully, Jessica," she said. Maybe I was too harsh before. I didn't say anything, just smiled and thanked her. It wasn't a full apology, not yet, but it was the closest she'd ever come to one, and this time there was no pride in her tone, only honesty. A few weeks after Patricia's injury healed, things between us settled into a quiet, steady rhythm. There were polite messages here and there, photos of her garden, short updates about the library where she'd started volunteering, or reminders about upcoming birthdays. No drama, no overstepping. So one Friday morning, I decided to take a small risk. I called and invited her for Sunday lunch at our house. I wanted to see if our new piece could hold on familiar ground. She arrived right on time. For the first time ever, she knocked and waited. When I opened the door, she held out a small bouquet of flowers instead of her usual cleaning gloves or containers of food. It was a simple gesture, but it said more than words could. I noticed her glance toward the house rules frame that still hung by the entryway. She smiled faintly and said, "Fair enough," before stepping inside. We started cooking together. It was strange but easy. She didn't rearrange the spice rack or question how I chopped vegetables. Instead, she asked where things were, waited for directions, and listened. I showed her where the pans were, and she nodded, moving carefully, as if she didn't want to disturb the balance of the room. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching with quiet amusement. Lunch was calm, something I never thought I'd say about a meal that included Patricia. The table was set simply, the air light, and the conversation steady. Daniel looked around midway through the meal and said it might be the most peaceful lunch we'd ever had. Even the silence between sentences felt natural instead of tense. Halfway through, my phone rang. I excused myself for a minute to take it in the hallway. When I came back, Patricia had refilled everyone's glasses and tidied the counter, but she hadn't touched a single thing out of place. It was small, but I noticed. After lunch, we started clearing dishes together. She began to correct how I was loading the dishwasher, but caught herself mid-sentence, taking a breath before quietly changing the subject. I didn't mention it, but the pause spoke volumes. Once everything was cleaned up, we sat in the living room with coffee and talked about everyday things. Daniel's recent promotion, my new work schedule, and the reading group Patricia had joined at the library. She seemed genuinely happy talking about it, no bragging or comparisons, just simple conversation. Before long, the talk drifted toward the house. Patricia looked around slowly and said the place looked warm and comfortable. "It feels like a home where people live, not where they're managed," she said. It caught me off guard. A compliment so direct from her felt rare. I thanked her and told her it took time to make it feel that way. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Patricia said something I never expected. She admitted she'd spent most of her life mistaking control for love. She said she thought being strict meant protecting her family, but it only made people afraid to relax around her. I told her it's hard to change what the world keeps rewarding, being the one who fixes, corrects, and directs. She nodded, and for the first time, the understanding between us didn't need to be explained. Daniel broke the moment with a laugh, saying it was the first time he'd seen both of us look calm in the same room. Patricia smiled at him and agreed that peace felt better than being right. When it was time for her to leave, she hugged Daniel, then me. After the door closed, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked under the house rules frame by the entryway. It was folded neatly. In her handwriting it said, "Thank you for teaching me without breaking me." I didn't frame it or show it to Daniel right away. I just slipped it inside one of my cookbooks on the shelf, the one we'd used that afternoon. The house was still and quiet again, but not in the way it used to be. The tension that once lived in every corner was gone. This time, peace didn't come from proving a point or enforcing a rule. It came from both of us, finally learning what respect actually looked like, something that no sign on the wall could ever teach on its own. By early winter, months had passed without a single tense moment. Daniel and I had settled into our usual routine: quiet mornings, steady workdays, peaceful evenings. Then one afternoon, Patricia called. Her voice was warm, almost uncertain, as she invited us to an early holiday dinner. There was no hint of expectation, no guilt in her tone. She just wanted us to come. I agreed. This time I didn't sense tension, just curiosity about what kind of dinner she would host now. When we arrived, the change was obvious before we even stepped inside. Her house, once spotless to the point of discomfort, felt lived in. A soft holiday playlist played in the background. The lights were gentle instead of blinding, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon instead of disinfectant. There were no assigned seats, no rigidly folded napkins. Patricia greeted us with hugs and led us into the kitchen, where she was still stirring sauce, something she'd never allow before guests arrived. She wasn't hosting alone either. A neighbor and her teenage daughter were already seated at the table, chatting comfortably. Patricia explained that she'd invited them because she wanted a relaxed evening. She didn't once give an instruction or correct anyone. During dinner, the neighbor's daughter accidentally spilled her drink, and for a second everyone froze. Everyone except Patricia. She laughed softly, grabbed a towel, and helped clean it up, saying it was no big deal. I caught Daniel's glance from across the table. Neither of us had ever seen her handle a mess with laughter instead of panic. Dinner was simple and warm: roasted chicken, vegetables, and one of my recipes. When the neighbor complimented the food, Patricia smiled and said, "Jessica taught me this one." It's simple but comforting. It was the first time she'd given me open credit for anything domestic. After dessert, Patricia didn't rush to clear the table or correct anyone's manners. She asked about my night shifts and Daniel's promotion, listening more than talking. She mentioned that she'd been learning to enjoy quiet moments. That silence didn't mean something was wrong. Once the guests left, Patricia poured tea for the three of us. The room was calm, no tension, no unfinished business hanging in the air. She looked around her living room and said, "It feels good not having to be perfect." I told her it felt good not having to defend myself. Daniel just smiled. Then her phone rang. It was her cousin, asking if she could host the extended family Christmas gathering like she used to. Patricia hesitated, then politely declined. "I think it's time someone else takes charge this year," she said, and hung up. That small sentence said more than any apology could. Before we left, she asked me to come see her winter garden. The flowers were gone, but the soil was neatly turned, ready for spring. She looked at the bare plants and said, "I used to think control made things grow. Turns out patience does more." We stood under the porch light for a while without speaking. There were no apologies, no speeches, just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had changed. On the drive home, Daniel said he never thought he'd see her change like that. I told him she just needed someone to hold up the mirror long enough. A few weeks later, Laura called, laughing that their mother had told her to let the kids handle their own chores. It sounded like a joke, but we both knew it wasn't. Right before Christmas, Patricia stopped by unannounced, but she knocked before entering. She held a small box of cookies and a thin notebook labeled New House Rules. Inside were 3 short lines: "Knock first, ask before helping. Respect goes both ways." After she left, I placed the notebook on the coffee table. The house was quiet again, but this time it wasn't the silence of tension. It was peace, earned and steady. The war that started over house rules had ended in something stronger, mutual respect that finally felt real. I'm a 29-year-old woman, and if you met my family, you'd probably think my older sister Charlotte is the star of it. She's 31, works as a social worker, and has the kind of personality that fills every room she walks into. I'm a marketing consultant. I prefer plans over noise and results over attention. That difference has always been there. She thrives on people's reactions, and I work quietly until the job's done. Our parents, Helen and David, call her the people person. They say I'm the steady one. It sounds fair until you see how praise gets divided. Charlotte tells one moving story, and they beam like she cured the world. I land a major client, and I get a polite nod and a white. That's nice, dear. It's always been that way. 2 years ago, I bought my own apartment. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I like calm spaces, a clean kitchen, and evenings where no one's interrupting. Charlotte calls it lonely living. She says it with a teasing laugh, but she tells others she worries about me being isolated. Somehow, her pity stories always sound noble when she tells them. She has a habit of retelling things that happened, small family moments, work updates, childhood memories, but in her version, she's always the one who fixed everything. If I repaired Dad's old laptop, Charlotte encouraged me to try. If Mom finally took my advice about her fundraiser, Charlotte made it happen. It's not lying exactly, it's rewriting. She smooths her own reflection into every story until no one can tell what's real. When I got promoted to lead a statewide marketing campaign for a regional chain, I was proud. It was the first time my work would be public, with my name attached to the results. Charlotte congratulated me like she meant it, then started talking about ethical storytelling and how she could help me shape the message. I didn't ask for her help, but she started acting like part of the team anyway. At a family dinner, she told everyone she was helping Isabel with the ethics part of her project. I corrected her lightly, saying the company had its own ethics consultant, but Mom waved me off, saying I shouldn't sound so defensive. The table moved on, but the damage didn't stay there. A few days later, one of my clients asked if Charlotte's role in the campaign was official. That was when I realized her stories had traveled beyond family chatter. I called her afterward and told her not to represent herself as part of my work. She smiled through the phone, saying she was just proud and that people like a sister success story. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. Then it escalated. A small local blog interviewed her about community work, and she told them she'd recently advised her sister on an ethical marketing project. They printed it word for word. My boss forwarded it to me with a polite question mark. I had to explain, send internal records, and clarify that no outside consultant was involved. It didn't ruin anything, but it made me look careless. When I told Mom about it, she sighed and said, "Charlotte only wanted to support you." Dad stayed quiet. I realized that in our family, Charlotte's intentions always mattered more than her impact. That night, I stopped explaining and started collecting. Every public post, every quote, every version of events where Charlotte turned herself into my partner, I saved it all. It wasn't about revenge. I just knew that if this kept going, I'd need proof of how far she'd stretched the truth. For the first time, I stopped trying to correct the story she told about me. Instead, I began preparing to tell my own, one that didn't need her edits. The next few months were quiet on the surface, but I started keeping a private record of everything Charlotte said that turned my work into hers. Every post, comment, or text where she found a way to slide herself into my story went into a folder. I didn't tell anyone about it. I just wanted proof of what was happening in case her imagination spilled into something that mattered. Not long after that, I got invited to work with a nonprofit on a community marketing campaign. It was smaller than my corporate projects, but more personal, focused on helping local small businesses reach people online. It was my first time working outside the usual corporate space, and I liked that it was something I could own from the start. The press release hadn't even gone live for 24 hours when Charlotte posted online about it. She shared the nonprofit's announcement with a caption about how proud she was of her little sister for finally joining the causes we've always cared about. It sounded harmless, but within a week, the nonprofit's director emailed me, asking if Charlotte would be joining our strategy meetings since she seemed to have a strong background in outreach. I spent that afternoon fixing confusion that shouldn't have existed. I replied politely, saying Charlotte wasn't involved in the project, and thanking them for asking. Then I posted a short message on my professional page, thanking collaborators by name and making it clear that I operated independently. I didn't mention Charlotte, just facts. That evening, Mom called. She said my post sounded cold and that people might think I was ungrateful. I explained that it wasn't about feelings. It was about accuracy. She sighed, said she knew I didn't mean to sound harsh, and still found a way to make it about Charlotte's good intentions. A few days later, I started hearing from coworkers that people were saying the nonprofit idea came from Charlotte's community vision. She'd apparently been telling people she had inspired me to take on meaningful work. It wasn't the first time she'd done it, but it was the first time it reached people I actually worked with. I noted everything quietly. My friend Maya noticed the pattern faster than I did. Over lunch, she mentioned how Charlotte always made herself sound like the reason behind anything I accomplished. When I thought about it, she was right. It was always we in Charlotte's stories, never Isabel. The next family gathering was a big barbecue at my parents' house. I kept my distance from Charlotte, but she found her way into the spotlight as always. Surrounded by cousins and family friends, she started telling everyone how proud she was that I'd finally acted on the talk we had about giving back. I watched people nod and smile, assuming the story was true. I didn't plan to respond, but when someone asked how that talk had led to the project, I just explained that it had started with a client brief and a proposal I'd developed months earlier. The conversation went still for a second. Charlotte forced a laugh and said I was too humble. Her tone didn't match her words. Dinner went on awkwardly after that. When I left, she messaged me accusing me of embarrassing her in front of everyone. I read it, closed the app, and didn't answer. Later that night, Mom called again, saying I should keep peace for the family's sake. I told her peace wasn't possible if truth kept being rewritten. By then I realized Charlotte wasn't going to stop. Correcting her privately only gave her a chance to twist things again later. I decided that next time she made up another version of my story, I wouldn't argue behind the scenes. I'd correct it calmly, publicly, and with proof. No emotion, no debate, just facts. The nonprofit project officially launched a few weeks later, and the results came faster than anyone expected. Local news covered it, small businesses tagged the campaign online, and my name was printed in the credits section. It was the first time I'd seen my work recognized publicly without someone else's version attached to it, at least for a few days. Then Charlotte found it. She reposted one of the articles on her social media with a long caption about how proud she was that I'd finally found my way into meaningful community work. She added that it had been a goal we'd shared for years. The comments filled up with people praising her for being a great influence. A few even congratulated her directly for mentoring me. That week, the nonprofit's PR manager emailed me to ask whether Charlotte was officially part of the team, since some sources seemed to suggest it. I sent over the documentation showing the official contributors, and clarified that the project was handled entirely through my firm. The manager apologized, but it was clear they'd seen Charlotte's posts. I didn't bother trying to make her delete them. Instead, I saved screenshots and continued working, but soon enough it spilled offline again. At the next family dinner, Charlotte made a speech about helping others even when they don't appreciate it. She looked at me the whole time she spoke. The table went quiet, except for Mom, who smiled awkwardly and said she was proud of both her girls. I stayed quiet, but Dad's patience finally cracked. He asked Charlotte, in front of everyone, what exactly she thought she'd help me with. The silence that followed felt like the first honest moment our family had in months. Charlotte stammered something about emotional support, then left early. Mom scolded Dad after she left, saying he shouldn't have humiliated her. He just shook his head and said it was time someone asked. A few days later, another article came out about the campaign's success. This one was larger, regional instead of local. Charlotte reposted it again but added herself into the story, claiming she'd guided the values behind the project. That post reached one of my new clients, who asked if I was expanding into social advocacy consulting. I spent another afternoon fixing what she broke. 2 weeks later, I was invited to speak on a leadership panel about authenticity in marketing. It felt like a big step. I didn't tell Charlotte or my parents until the schedule went public, mostly because I knew she'd find out anyway. And she did. When the event's post went online, she started tagging herself under it, commenting things like "so proud of my sister's journey into cause-based branding." The day of the event, I noticed her name on the guest list even though she hadn't been invited. She showed up halfway through, walking around as if she belonged there. During the break, she introduced herself to other attendees as the sister who inspired the program. A journalist covering the event recognized me and pulled me aside later. He quietly asked if that claim was true since Charlotte had implied she'd been part of the concept. I showed him my drafts, proposals, and time-stamped communication with the nonprofit. He nodded, thanked me, and said he'd be writing a follow-up article. When it came out, it included a line about how the initiative had been entirely designed and executed by Isabel Harper, whose approach to ethical marketing emphasizes accountability and transparency. There was no mention of Charlotte anywhere. That night, the family group chat was silent. Usually, Charlotte was the first to send something, some photo, quote, or message to reset the tone. This time, she said nothing. I thought maybe she'd stop after that, but a week later, she showed up at my apartment with coffee and a bright smile, talking about moving forward. I let her in out of politeness. She started telling me how hard it was being misunderstood, and that she never meant to overshadow anyone. I just listened, said I had a deadline, and walked her to the door. By the weekend, she was back online again, posting about how easy it is for people to twist good intentions. She didn't use names, but everyone knew who she meant. Mom called, telling me to ignore it, but I noticed even she sounded tired this time. At work, though, things kept improving. The project was nominated for a regional award, and the nonprofit asked me to lead another campaign. My manager congratulated me in front of the team. That same afternoon, one of my coworkers mentioned that Charlotte had posted a behind-the-scenes story saying she was so proud of what our conversation started. It was clear now that she wasn't going to stop trying to attach herself to my work, no matter how many quiet corrections I made. But something shifted after that journalist's article. For the first time, her version of things didn't stick. People had seen the truth printed clearly, and there wasn't much she could do to rewrite it. When Dad visited me a week later, he handed me a clipping of the article he'd printed out. He said he kept it because it was the first time he'd seen my name on something public, without Charlotte's attached to it. I didn't say much, just thanked him. That evening, I opened my laptop and updated my folder, screenshots, emails, and now press coverage. Every piece of it mattered. Charlotte might still try to spin her stories, but the difference was that I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The facts could do it for me. And judging by her silence after that article, she knew it too. Weeks went by without a single word from Charlotte. Family dinners grew awkward. Mom made excuses about her being busy with work, while Dad stayed quiet through most of the meal. I knew silence wasn't retreat, it was regrouping. Charlotte never disappeared without reason. She paused to plan the next story. During that time, my career moved faster than it ever had. The success of the nonprofit campaign spread further than expected, and a national firm reached out asking if I'd consult on a regional marketing expansion. It was the kind of project that could open every door I'd been working toward for years. I accepted and kept my focus tight. For the first time in months, my name was circulating without Charlotte's attached to it. Then she showed up. One afternoon, my receptionist buzzed in to say my sister was in the lobby with flowers. When I stepped out, Charlotte was standing there, smiling like nothing had happened, holding a bright bouquet and greeting my staff by name. She talked loudly about being proud of me, about how we'd always believed in working hard for our dreams. My coworkers thought it was sweet. I thanked her, accepted the flowers, and walked her out before she could start wandering around. Later that week, one of my colleagues mentioned they'd heard Charlotte had motivated me to return to big projects after a hard time. The rumor had started circulating through shared contacts and clients. I realized she'd used that office visit to rebuild her image as part of my comeback story. I called my assistant the next morning and asked her to mark Charlotte as no walk-ins allowed. Any unannounced visitors were to be turned away, and all inquiries about me were to be routed directly through my email. It wasn't dramatic, it was protection. Mom called soon after, saying she'd heard Charlotte was trying to make peace and that I should meet her halfway. I told her boundaries weren't hostility, they were professionalism. She didn't like the phrasing, but I wasn't changing it. A few weeks later, I got news that I'd been nominated for a regional marketing award. It was a big deal in the industry and got some local press attention. The announcement alone drew attention from new clients. That's when Charlotte reappeared, again. At a charity function my company sponsored. She walked right up to my table where a few of my clients were seated. She laughed, hugged me, and introduced herself as the sister who pushed Isabel to aim higher. The clients looked confused but polite. I stood, thanked her for her encouragement, then clarified to everyone present that my achievements came from my professional mentors and team support. It was simple, calm, and final. The conversation shifted quickly after that, though the tension hung in the air. Later, a few people from that table quietly told me they admired how I'd handled it. They understood exactly what had happened without me having to explain. By the weekend, I found out Charlotte had told Mom that I'd made her look foolish in front of everyone. Mom sided with her, saying I could have ignored it and let it go. But Dad stepped in for once, telling her that what Charlotte was doing could damage my reputation. He told her privately that enough was enough. I didn't argue with either of them. Instead, I started expanding my records, notes, dates, and people who'd witnessed these little scenes. Every time she inserted herself into my work, I logged it. The more I reviewed the pattern, the clearer it became. This wasn't about jealousy or sabotage. Charlotte needed control, not just over how people saw her, but how they saw me. If my story existed without her in it, she lost part of her reflection. And if there was one thing Charlotte couldn't stand, it was being invisible. So I prepared quietly, waiting. Because the next time she tried to make herself part of my work again, I wouldn't just correct it, I'd be ready to dismantle it before it even began. When the regional marketing awards came around, my name was announced as one of the winners. I brought my colleagues and my dad to the ceremony. Mom and Charlotte weren't invited. I didn't want any scenes, and I knew exactly how both of them could turn attention into chaos. The event was formal but warm, with industry people from all over the state. When my name was called, I went on stage and thanked my team, the clients, and my mentors. My speech focused on authenticity and accountability, how real progress comes from owning your narrative instead of borrowing someone else's. The words were deliberate. A few people who knew my background gave knowing smiles. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Charlotte. She congratulated me and added, "I'm proud you finally took my advice." I didn't answer. 2 days later, my phone started buzzing again, but this time it wasn't her. A few mutual contacts reached out, saying they'd heard that Charlotte had helped me overcome my self-doubt before the award. She had apparently been telling people that she had been coaching me through personal growth. She turned a professional win into a story about her being the emotional architect behind it. Then it crossed into my work again. A potential client emailed me asking to confirm the joint social work initiative Charlotte had mentioned when they met at a local networking event. I stared at the message for a while before replying. I sent a professional clarification, included links to my verified work, and explained there was no joint project. The client appreciated my quick response and confirmed they'd be proceeding directly with me. That night, Mom invited everyone over for a small dinner. I hadn't seen Charlotte since the award ceremony. She arrived dressed like she was attending another gala, full of smiles and stories. During the meal, she mentioned to everyone that she was glad she could connect me with that client. I didn't say a word, but Dad put his fork down and asked her what she meant. When she stumbled, he told her to stop inserting herself into my work. Mom tried to smooth things over by saying we should just drop it, but the point had already landed. Charlotte stood up, muttered that no one appreciated her support, and walked out. For the first time, Dad didn't go after her. The silence afterward said more than anything else could. Over the next week, I started hearing from relatives. A few of them admitted they'd noticed how Charlotte's help always came with her name front and center. The more people saw it, the less convincing her act became. At work, things evolved quickly too. My firm decided to assign a communications advisor to help manage public mentions and brand accuracy, since my name was becoming more visible. It was a professional move, but it doubled as a shield. Any misrepresentation could now be caught early and corrected before it spread. Then came the message from Charlotte. She texted me a long apology, saying she didn't mean to cause any PR confusion, then added, "But at least they're talking about you now." It was a backhanded apology wrapped in self-congratulation. I replied with one line, that my career and personal life needed to stay separate from now on. That same night, Dad called to tell me he'd had enough of defending her. He told Mom plainly that he wasn't going to cushion Charlotte's ego anymore. He said if she wanted to act like an adult, she could face consequences like one. It was the first time he had drawn a clear line. And something shifted after that. The family group chat stayed quiet, but no one pushed me to fix things anymore. A week later, an announcement went out that I'd been invited to speak at a national business conference about ethical storytelling and marketing. It was one of the biggest opportunities of my career so far. Within hours, Charlotte reposted the announcement with a caption about how family values always come full circle. I knew that tone. It meant she was getting ready to step into my spotlight again. But this time, I wasn't just prepared for it. I had every email, message, and post she'd ever twisted. And now I had professionals watching the narrative too. Whatever she tried next, it wouldn't just expose her intentions, it would leave her standing alone in a story she could no longer control. The national conference was the biggest event I'd ever spoken at. Months of planning, rehearsals, and media coordination went into it. My company made it clear that all press and attendee interactions had to go through their communications office. It was strict, but after what happened with Charlotte before, I understood why. When the event lineup went public, my name was featured alongside top executives and marketing directors. Within a few hours, Charlotte shared the announcement with a caption about how proud she was of her little sister for following in her footsteps. I ignored it. But soon after, one of the conference organizers forwarded me an email from someone claiming to be my advisor. The sender was Charlotte. She had introduced herself as my ethics consultant and asked to join the networking dinner. I replied through my company's PR manager, thanking the organizer for the heads up and explaining that Charlotte was not affiliated with any of my professional work. They removed her name from all lists immediately. I added the screenshots to my growing record. The day of the conference arrived. I was scheduled for an afternoon slot, and by the time I got to the venue, the crowd was larger than expected. My presentation covered ethical storytelling and marketing accountability, topics I'd been building my reputation on for years. The talk went smoothly, and the Q&A that followed had people asking about mentorship and client trust. It felt solid, focused, and completely mine. When I stepped off stage, I noticed Charlotte standing outside the hall, talking to two journalists. She was animated, smiling, pointing toward the room I'd just left. I caught pieces of her words, something about being part of the original development team for my outreach framework. The journalists were scribbling notes. I walked over calmly, greeted everyone, and thanked them for attending. Then I clarified that Charlotte wasn't associated with my firm or the project, but I appreciated her enthusiasm. The journalists exchanged quick glances and thanked us both before turning back to their notes. Charlotte's face froze for a second. That evening, one of those journalists published a short piece about the event. It praised my presentation and mentioned the importance of defining one's narrative amid outside noise. There was no reference to Charlotte, but everyone who had been there knew what that line meant. After that, the shift was immediate. People who once entertained Charlotte's claims started avoiding them. At networking events, when she tried to join conversations about my work, others changed the subject. She had burned her own credibility without realizing it. At home, the divide in the family deepened. Dad congratulated me again and told Mom he was proud of how I'd handled things professionally. Mom still tried to soften Charlotte's behavior, saying she just wanted to be included. I didn't argue, but I stopped attending dinners where Charlotte would be. I shared nothing about my projects, not even general updates. Anything I said became material for her next story. A few weeks later, a PR coordinator from another firm sent me screenshots of a community initiative Charlotte had announced online. The name and structure were almost identical to the corporate outreach program I designed the previous year. Even the graphics looked copied. The comments under her post were full of people congratulating her for carrying forward her sister's ideas. I didn't react. Instead, I forwarded everything to my company's legal department and waited. While they reviewed the materials, Charlotte continued posting updates about her new project, sharing identical phrasing from my presentation slides. She even gave an interview where she described the program as something she had helped develop for years. A week later, the company's attorney contacted her formally. The letter was professional but firm. It detailed every instance of copied language, structure, and design, and demanded that she remove all infringing content immediately. Within days, her website went offline. The posts disappeared one by one. No public statement followed. Professionally, the incident barely caused a ripple. If anything, it strengthened my position. Industry peers saw how calmly and cleanly it had been handled. Colleagues respected the way I kept emotion out of it. At the next family dinner, Mom tried to bring up the situation, saying Charlotte didn't mean any harm. Dad cut her off, saying that wasn't the point anymore. Charlotte sat quietly the entire time, eating in silence. When relatives congratulated me on the success of my recent campaigns, she didn't interrupt or add anything. She just smiled faintly, then changed the subject. I didn't gloat. There was nothing left to say. Everything had played out exactly as it was supposed to. Not because I exposed her, but because I let her expose herself. By the end of that year, my firm promoted me to lead strategist, and the nonprofit partnership that started it all became a national model. My name stood on its own. No extra voices, no borrowed light. Charlotte still came to family gatherings, polite but quiet. The spotlight she once fought for now stayed off her. I didn't need to reclaim my story anymore. It already belonged to me. About a month after the conference, people began tagging me in posts about a new community outreach program launched by Charlotte. The comments congratulated us both on working together again. When I opened the link, I froze for a moment, not because it was surprising, but because it was predictable. The name of her program was almost identical to mine. The logo looked like a cheaper version of the one my team designed. And the description? Entire paragraphs matched word for word from my own presentation slides. Even the layout, font choices, and case studies were copied. It wasn't inspiration anymore, it was replication. By the next day, a long-term partner called to congratulate me on expanding the brand with family. That's when I knew the confusion was spreading again. I clarified calmly that there was no joint venture and sent over documentation proving my campaign's official registration and ownership. The partner apologized and said they'd already suspected something wasn't right. A mutual contact who attended Charlotte's launch event sent me her slide deck. It was the same structure, same phrasing, and even the same closing slogan, just with her name on it. She hadn't even changed the sequence of examples. The more I looked at it, the clearer it became that she didn't just borrow from me. She built her entire project on my blueprint. Instead of calling her, I went straight to my company's legal department. The review didn't take long. They confirmed multiple instances of copyright and intellectual property infringement. The advice was simple: keep everything documented and let the process unfold formally. A few days later, Mom called. She said Charlotte was upset, that she felt left out of the legacy we could have built together. I told her originality wasn't exclusion. Copying someone's work wasn't collaboration. Mom tried to reason with me, but the conversation ended when I reminded her that Charlotte's actions had real-world consequences now. The next morning, I texted Charlotte and asked to meet at a quiet cafe near my office. She arrived cheerful, expecting a conversation she could control. I laid both projects side by side, mine and hers. The matching details were undeniable. Her expression tightened as she flipped the pages. She started explaining that she only borrowed my structure so she could spread the impact faster. She said I should be proud that she admired my work enough to use it. I told her pride and permission weren't the same thing. Then I informed her that my company would be sending her a formal notice. For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. When Mom found out, she called it unnecessary. Dad disagreed. He told her this had gone far enough, that protecting my work wasn't cruelty, it was accountability. He said if Charlotte wanted to act like a professional, she needed to face professional consequences. The cease and desist letter was sent that week. It detailed every copied element and demanded immediate removal and clarification. Within days, Charlotte's website and promotional materials vanished. The launch announcement was deleted without explanation. The story traveled through local professional circles quickly, but not as gossip, just as acknowledgement. People discussed it quietly, noting how lines between inspiration and imitation could blur when ambition outran ethics. Her credibility faded almost overnight. For me, things only grew. The company used the incident as a teaching case in internal workshops about intellectual ownership. My project, the original one, expanded nationally within months. I was invited to mentor others on how to build transparent, accountable social initiatives, the same values Charlotte had tried to claim as her own. When the next family dinner came, I expected some tension, but the air was calm. Relatives congratulated me for the expansion, and even Mom kept her tone neutral. Charlotte was there, sitting across the table. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to add herself into the story. She just listened. I thanked everyone for their kind words, then changed the subject. For the first time in years, there was no correction to make, no rumor to fix, no story to reclaim. The spotlight had moved back where it belonged, and this time, it stayed there. I'm Julia, 32, an accountant living in a quiet suburb near Chicago. For as long as I can remember, my mother Diane has said the same line, family looks after family. She used it for everything, rides to appointments, money for errands, weekends spent fixing things she could have hired someone to do. After my parents divorced when I was 12, she'd lean on that phrase like it was a rule carved in stone. Back then, it sounded warm. As I got older, it started to feel like a command. Diane had a talent for turning guilt into routine. Saving for myself was selfish. Buying anything beyond what I needed was forgetting who raised me. If I picked up extra hours, she'd remind me that good daughters share what they earn. It wasn't open manipulation. It was quiet and constant, the kind that turns generosity into obligation before you realize it. I worked through college, paid every bill on time, and built a stable career. The day I bought my first home, a small one-story place with an overgrown backyard, I felt like I had finally drawn a line between my life and hers. I wasn't wealthy, but I was independent, and that felt like enough. A few months after moving in, the phone rang one evening. Diane's voice shook as she told me her company was forcing her into early retirement. She said it wasn't fair, that her boss had used her age against her, and now she couldn't afford her rent. The tears came fast, and before I even thought it through, I told her I'd help. At first, it was a few $100s a month. Temporary, I told myself. She called it just until she got back on her feet. But the next month, she thanked me for our budget. The month after that, she mentioned needing to adjust our grocery plan. My account balance went down while her expectations went up. Soon she was calling relatives, telling them how lucky she was to have such a devoted daughter. I found out because my aunt called to praise me, repeating Diane's story word for word. Later that night, Diane messaged me saying I owed her this comfort, that I was only returning what she'd given up raising me alone. It was the same guilt, just dressed in gratitude this time. Things didn't add up. She claimed her pension was frozen, yet she posted pictures from weekend trips with friends and fancy lunches downtown. It didn't fit the story of someone struggling. I checked what I could, quietly, through financial records she'd once asked me to help organize. That's when I found out the truth. Diane had voluntarily cashed out her pension months earlier, taking a lump sum and burning through it within weeks. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. She just started crying, accusing me of turning my back on my only parent. The next day, relatives called to ask why I was abandoning her. It was clear who'd fed them the story. I met with a financial advisor who confirmed what I already knew. If Diane had managed her money responsibly, she'd have been fine. Instead, she chose comfort over caution, knowing I'd catch her when she fell. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad, running numbers and sketching plans. If she needed help, fine, but it wouldn't come wrapped in guilt anymore. It would be structured, written, and fair. No more family looks after family as a rule, just clear terms. When Diane called again, saying her landlord was threatening eviction, her voice trembling through the receiver, I didn't rush to reassure her this time. I waited until she stopped talking. "You can move in with me," I said evenly, after signing something first. I invited my mother over for dinner on a quiet Friday night. The table was set simply: 2 plates, a candle, and the lease papers tucked neatly under a folder beside me. I cooked her favorite meal, something that would make the evening feel calm before I got to the reason she was there. Diane arrived cheerful, talking about how the moving company had overcharged her and how lucky she was that I had so much space in my house. When dinner was nearly over, I mentioned that living together could help both of us save money. Her face lit up instantly. She started thanking me, calling me her sweet, selfless daughter. She told me I'd finally realized what family was all about, assuming that meant I was offering her a free place to live. I waited until she finished, then slid the folder toward her. Inside was the lease. The rent was modest, less than half of what she'd paid before, and it laid out a few simple rules. Payments would be made on the first of each month, utilities split evenly, and shared spaces respected. She glanced at it and laughed, thinking I was joking. But when I didn't laugh back, the smile dropped from her face. She stared at the document for a long time before saying she couldn't believe I'd charge my own mother rent. I kept my voice steady, explaining that it was a way to protect both of us. She started crying softly, accusing me of treating her like a stranger. I didn't respond to the drama. I just folded the lease back and told her to think it over. The next morning, my phone filled with messages from relatives. My aunt said I'd humiliated my poor mother. My cousin said Diane had called her crying, claiming I was turning my house into a boarding house. I sent one group message in reply, explaining that my home was open to my mother but that financial arrangements had to be fair and written. After that, I muted the chat and didn't respond again. 2 days later, Diane called, saying she'd sign the papers if it would make me feel better. She insisted it was only symbolic. I agreed and made an appointment for us to sign and notarize the document that afternoon. She didn't realize that her symbolic signature made the lease fully binding. When moving day came, she arrived with far more than we'd agreed on. The moving truck was packed with old furniture, boxes labeled heirlooms, and even her old dining table. When I reminded her we'd only cleared 1 bedroom and partial storage, she brushed it off, saying these things couldn't be left behind. That first week was quiet. I gave her space and went to work like normal. But small changes started showing up. The living room rug was replaced with hers. My framed photos were taken down and replaced with her floral prints. She introduced herself to my neighbors as my co-owner. I found out about that when Mrs. Howard from next door congratulated me on letting my mother retire early. Apparently, Diane had told people I insisted she stop working and move in so I could take care of her properly. At first, I ignored it. I didn't argue or correct anyone. But when I came home one evening to find the couch moved, the curtains changed, and my mother telling a delivery driver to leave the package under my name, I decided to clarify things. I reminded her that the lease defined her as a tenant, not an owner. She rolled her eyes and said that paper didn't change the fact that she was my mother and always would be. From that point on, I started keeping records, dates, texts, bills, everything. I made copies of the lease and receipts and kept them in a locked folder in my office. I logged each month's rent status, each bill she was responsible for, and every purchase she made using my address. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. When the first rent date came and went, she said she was sorting out her cash flow. A week later, she bought new curtains and decorative pillows for the living room. I didn't argue. I noted the date, wrote payment missed, month 1 in my binder, and went about my day. By the end of that month, she'd filled the guest closet with shopping bags and started talking about repainting her living room. She even mentioned to my aunt that we were redoing the house together. I didn't correct her. I just added another note in my file. It was clear she thought she could treat this house like her retirement nest and me like her safety net. But she didn't realize I was no longer reacting to her guilt trips. I was documenting them. I wasn't planning on another confrontation. I was planning for proof. When the second rent date arrived and she skipped payment again, she gave the same excuse. I simply wrote it down, added the receipts for her online purchases, and closed the folder. I didn't argue or remind her. I was waiting quietly for the moment she would push hard enough to prove exactly why that signature mattered. Another month passed, and the pattern was clear. No rent, no acknowledgement, and no sign that Diane planned to take the agreement seriously. Packages kept arriving with her name on them. New shoes, clothes, and kitchenware she didn't need. Takeout bags piled up in the bin, each charged to my shared address. Every time I came home, the counters were cluttered with receipts and delivery boxes. When she spoke to neighbors, she referred to herself as retired and comfortable, as if she'd planned this life. Her friends stopped by often, dropping off plants and magazines. To them, she looked like a woman enjoying her golden years. To me, she was a tenant who hadn't paid rent in 2 months. One evening, over coffee, I reminded her politely about the overdue payments. She brushed it off, saying she'd settle things next month. I mentioned that the lease required consistent payment. That's when the calm cracked. She slammed her cup down and accused me of treating her like a stranger in her own daughter's home. Before I could answer, she walked off and shut her door hard enough to rattle the frame. A few days later, I came home from work and froze in the doorway. The living room walls, which had been a soft gray, were now painted a pale yellow. My framed photos were gone, replaced with Diane's old floral paintings. The couch had been swapped out for her heavier one from storage. The house didn't look like mine anymore. It looked like the one she used to have before retirement. The next morning, I walked into my kitchen and found 3 women sitting around the table, drinking coffee and laughing. Diane was hosting a brunch, using my food and dishes. She waved toward me and introduced me as my landlord's daughter. The women laughed, assuming it was a joke. I didn't correct them. I just made a note in my phone to document the incident later. That afternoon, I took photos of the newly painted walls and furniture. I added the pictures to my file, along with a copy of the lease, the missing rent log, and recent bills showing increased water and electricity usage. Then I called the utility company and had the account split. From that day forward, Diane's name appeared next to mine on every bill. When the next round of statements arrived, I paid only my half. 2 weeks later, she found out. She stormed into the kitchen, holding the overdue notice, demanding to know why I hadn't taken care of it. I didn't answer. I simply pointed to the line with her name and the due amount next to it, then went back to my laptop. Her reaction was predictable. A few days later, my phone started lighting up with calls from relatives again. My aunt left a voicemail saying Diane was heartbroken, telling everyone her daughter had started charging her to live under her own roof. I didn't reply to anyone. The messages went unanswered. Instead, I called my lawyer. I explained the situation, forwarded the updated documents, and asked for a quick review. After looking through everything, he confirmed that my lease and records were completely enforceable. If Diane didn't pay, eviction could proceed legally. He advised me to stay calm, keep documenting, and wait for the next missed payment before taking action. From that day, I recorded everything. Each delivery, each bill, each message. The file on my desk grew thicker every week. The story Diane told others was one of a cold daughter pushing her mother out. The story my folder told was very different. Late one evening, while cleaning up, I overheard her talking on the phone in her room. She was laughing with someone, saying she wasn't worried about rent because Julia would never dare evict her own mother. I stopped halfway down the hall, listened long enough to be sure I'd heard her right, then turned and went back to my office. The next morning, I made coffee as usual. When she came into the kitchen, I placed an envelope on the table beside her mug. It was a formal rent demand letter on my lawyer's letterhead, short, clear, and polite. It listed the total owed, the payment deadline, and the clause outlining eviction if rent wasn't paid within 10 days. Diane looked at the letter for a long moment, then tore it in half and threw it into the trash. She said she couldn't believe her own daughter would disown her like this. I didn't respond. I just poured another cup of coffee, picked up the torn pieces, placed them in a folder with the others, and added a note with the date and time. Before leaving for work, I printed another copy of the same letter, sealed it, and slid it into my filing cabinet. I wasn't planning another argument. The paper trail was already speaking louder than any words ever could. After tearing up the first rent notice, Diane stopped speaking to me altogether. Days went by where she wouldn't say a word, just left sarcastic notes around the house. One appeared on the fridge, "Respect your elders." Another sat on the kitchen counter under a pile of unpaid bills. "Family shouldn't need contracts." Each one was written in looping cursive, like little reminders that she still believed guilt counted as authority. I didn't respond. Instead, I printed another copy of the rent demand letter, this time sent through certified mail, addressed to her room, time-stamped and signed by my lawyer. The receipt came back 2 days later with her signature confirming delivery. The silence continued, but now it was official. Not long after, I started hearing things from neighbors. Mrs. Howard stopped me at the mailbox one morning and asked if everything was okay with my mother. Apparently, Diane had been telling people that I'd tricked her into signing legal traps and was trying to take her retirement money. The story spread fast. She'd turned the lease into proof of betrayal. I called my lawyer, who told me not to respond publicly. He said the documentation would speak for itself if things escalated. So I stayed quiet, even when another neighbor made a snide comment about charging rent to your own mother. I let the rumors run their course. They wouldn't hold up once the facts came out. The next problem appeared in the garage. I kept a few old furniture pieces there, a small antique table from my grandmother, a mirror, a set of chairs. One afternoon, I noticed they were gone. I checked the storage list I kept on my phone, then called around. A local consignment shop confirmed that Diane had brought them in, saying she needed space at home. She'd already collected the money. I drove to the shop, got a copy of the transaction receipt, took a photo of the sold items on display, and added it all to my binder. Each piece was dated, labeled, and printed. When I got home, Diane was watering plants outside as if nothing had happened. I walked past her without a word. 2 days later, her friend Nancy showed up unannounced, holding a small gift bag and looking nervous. She said Diane had told everyone I threw her out and was locking her out of her own room. I opened the folder on the counter and showed her the lease, the payment logs, and the certified letters. I didn't add a single word beyond the paperwork. Nancy stood there for a moment, then nodded awkwardly and left. That was the first time I saw cracks in the story Diane had built. After that visit, Diane changed tactics. She declared she wouldn't pay for food or utilities until I treated her fairly. Groceries started disappearing faster, and the electricity bill climbed. I adjusted immediately. Every item in the pantry got a label. I divided shelves in the fridge, linked all utilities to automated reports, and began paying only my exact portion online, so each transaction was traceable. A week later, my lawyer issued one final notice: 10 days to pay, or eviction proceedings would begin. The letter was short and formal. I printed a copy for myself and delivered the original to her door. 2 nights later, Diane appeared in my room without knocking. Her eyes were red, and she carried the letter in one hand. She promised she'd make the payment next week if I'd just stop with the paperwork. I pointed toward her desk where the previous letters were stacked neatly in order and said nothing else. Everything that needed to be said was already written. 10 days passed, no payment, no acknowledgement. On the morning after the deadline, I drove to the post office and mailed the official eviction notice by certified delivery. The clerk stamped the envelope and handed me the receipt. I filed the tracking number and went back to work. That evening, Diane checked the mail before I could. When I came home, she was standing in the driveway holding the envelope, already opened. She read the document line by line, then threw it onto the ground. She shouted that she would make this right and that I'd regret embarrassing her. Then she stormed off toward the street, leaving her car keys and phone charger on the porch. The house was silent again, but this time the silence wasn't peaceful. Something told me her next move wouldn't be about money. It would be about reputation. And for that, I was already prepared. Every date, letter, and record filed in order, waiting for the moment someone would finally ask for proof. Days passed with no sign of my mother. Her car stayed gone, her room untouched, and her phone sat charging on the counter. At first, I thought she was staying with a friend to cool off. Then a letter showed up in my mailbox, sent by my cousin. It was short but sharp, accusing me of throwing my mother into the street and warning that Diane was seeking justice. Within hours, more messages came in from relatives. My aunt claimed my mother had been wrongfully evicted. Another cousin mentioned hearing the words elder abuse and financial exploitation. It was clear Diane hadn't disappeared quietly. She'd simply changed tactics. I called my lawyer the next morning and brought him everything. He flipped through the documents, leases, receipts, certified letters, and confirmed that every step I'd taken was compliant with landlord-tenant law. The lease was valid, the notices were served properly, and the eviction timeline was clean. He advised me to organize everything neatly in case the county or housing department contacted me. That evening, I built a new binder. Every transfer, text, and photo was indexed by date. A timeline ran along the side, showing each step of the process: rent due, notice sent, payment missed, notice followed. Each document had its own tab and backup copy. 3 days later, an official county envelope arrived. The letter inside stated that a complaint had been filed against me for financial exploitation of a dependent adult. Diane had accused me of coercing her into a lease and taking her money under false pretenses. I called my lawyer again, and we filed a formal response. He attached certified copies of the lease, the payment logs, and receipts showing Diane's discretionary spending on non-essential items during the same months she claimed hardship. We mailed it the same day. A week later, a housing investigator arrived at my door. She was polite but thorough, walking through each room, inspecting documents, and checking that Diane's personal belongings were still present. The spare room was just as she'd left it, clothes folded, cosmetics lined up, and boxes of her decor stacked neatly against the wall. When the investigator finished, she said she'd be interviewing Diane separately. I didn't ask where my mother was staying. I simply handed over copies of everything she requested. The report came back a few weeks later. The case was closed with no action. According to the investigator's summary, Diane had admitted under questioning that she voluntarily cashed out her own pension and had not been coerced into signing any documents. The lease and eviction process were found to be valid and legal. Soon, word spread through the family. Some of my mother's friends went quiet. Others who had repeated her claims stopped reaching out. The silence around her story was louder than any defense I could have made myself. Then, one afternoon, the phone rang. Her number appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Her tone was calm. She said she wanted to start over, that she just needed a place to stay rent-free until she was stable again. I told her I'd agree under one condition. Any unpaid rent from before would be converted into equity contributions under a new agreement. The updated contract would legally define me as the sole owner and landlord. She hesitated, saying she didn't understand all the legal terms, but eventually agreed as long as it was just symbolic. That same day, we met at my lawyer's office. She signed the document, and the notary sealed it. By that evening, I filed it with the local records office. A few days later, she stopped by the house to collect some of her things. While she was there, she asked to see the paperwork again, wanting to understand what she'd signed. I showed her the stamped copy, pointing out the clause that confirmed ownership transfer and full landlord rights. Her calm expression vanished. She raised her voice, accusing me of betrayal, saying I'd taken advantage of her. I didn't argue. I told her everything was fair, written down, and witnessed. The rules she'd ignored had finally caught up, and now they were binding. She gathered her purse, glared at me, and said she'd make this right one way or another. Then she left, slamming the door hard enough to shake the frame. I double-locked it after she was gone. For the first time, the house was completely still, but the quiet didn't feel permanent. It felt like the pause before something else, something no longer about family, but about revenge. The next move, I suspected, wouldn't come from her directly. It would come stamped, sealed, and delivered from somewhere far more official. Weeks passed in silence. The house stayed calm, the bills came on time, and work filled most of my days. For the first time in months, the mailbox didn't bring trouble. I paid off small debts, mowed the lawn, and went to bed without expecting another argument. It almost felt normal again, until the envelope arrived. It was a certified letter addressed in Diane's handwriting but mailed through an attorney's office. Inside, she claimed emotional damages from the eviction and partial ownership of furniture she'd left behind. The letter demanded payment or amicable settlement before court. I scanned it, took a photo for my files, and sent everything to my lawyer. Within a day, he drafted a reply. Attached was the signed inventory list Diane had completed when she moved in, her own handwriting marking the furniture as forfeit upon lease termination. It was notarized, dated, and clear. He sent the rebuttal by certified mail. A week later, a different envelope showed up. This one, handwritten and unstamped, slipped through my mail slot. It wasn't formal, it was desperate. Diane wrote that she'd drop everything if I wired her $5,000 to rebuild her life somewhere warm. The last line read, "You can end this now before I make it worse." I didn't answer. I forwarded it to my lawyer and instructed him to handle all communication going forward. I blocked her number and any route that led directly to me. 2 weeks later, the family calls began again. My aunt left a voicemail saying my mother had told everyone I'd stolen her home. A cousin mentioned Diane was sharing stories online about being tricked by paperwork. Then one of my aunts posted a public message defending her, tagging both of us. It gained a few sympathetic comments from family friends before anyone reached out to verify details. By that evening, I had already sent a small digital packet to each relative who'd called. It included the notarized lease, the equity conversion document, and the certified eviction notices, all time-stamped and witnessed. No explanations, no commentary, just the paperwork. By the next day, the post was deleted, and the calls stopped entirely. A few days after that, Diane's legal complaint escalated for one last attempt. Her lawyer filed a request for mediation, but the moment he reviewed the notarized ownership agreement, it ended. He formally withdrew from her representation, and the county marked the complaint as dismissed. Nearly a month later, I heard her car outside. I looked through the window and saw her standing on the porch holding a small box. She knocked once. When I opened the door, she said she'd come to collect her last few things. I allowed her inside under supervision, keeping my phone camera on record in case of dispute. She moved slowly, scanning each room. The place looked different now, tidy, quiet, organized. She gathered a few framed photos, an old vase, and a couple of small trinkets from the dresser. She didn't look at me while she worked. When she reached the front door, she paused, glancing around the living room. Her voice was quiet when she said she never thought I'd treat her like any other tenant. I told her that was all I ever wanted, to be treated fairly. She didn't respond. She just stepped outside, carrying the box carefully, and walked to her car. I locked the door behind her and stood there for a long moment. The house was silent again, but not tense, just still. The next day, I drove to the records office and updated every property document, adding digital backups and new clauses for any future tenants, family or not. Every agreement would be notarized and stored twice over. No verbal promises, no favors, no gray areas. Later that week, I opened my binder, the one that had grown heavier with each problem, and went through it page by page. What had once been proof of defense now felt like a record of progress. Each letter and receipt marked a step toward stability I'd built on my own terms. A few weeks later, a small postcard arrived. The front showed a beach in Florida, the kind sold at gas stations. On the back, written in her unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words. At least now I pay rent to someone else. I read it once, placed it in the binder's final sleeve, and closed it for good. The story that had started with guilt and dependence had ended with signatures and silence. The house, once divided by control, finally belonged entirely to me, on paper and in peace. Months passed without a single message or unexpected knock. The house stayed quiet, the days predictable. Work filled the weekdays, and in the evenings I took walks around the neighborhood before reading by the window. The space that once felt like a battlefield finally settled into calm routine. The spare bedroom didn't stay empty for long. A nurse from the local hospital, Claire, answered an ad and moved in. She was polite, paid on time, and treated the space with respect. Rent came through on schedule every month. The utilities balanced perfectly, and there were no late-night arguments, no hidden notes, no chaos. With the extra income, I managed to clear the final payment on the mortgage. The house was officially debt-free. My savings started to grow again, slow but steady, after years of cleaning up financial messes that weren't mine. Each statement arriving in the mail felt like a small correction to the years that had gone wrong. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived at my office. It was from an attorney in Florida, the return address handwritten but familiar. The envelope had Diane's name in the corner. Inside, the tone was formal. The letter claimed entitlement to shared family assets connected to the sale of Julia's property. The problem was simple: there had been no sale. The assets she referred to were the antique pieces she'd taken from my garage months ago and sold herself. I forwarded the letter to my lawyer, who prepared a short, clean response. Attached was certified documentation proving Diane had forfeited all ownership rights during the equity conversion agreement she signed and notarized. The reply went out by overnight mail, and that was the end of it. A week later, another envelope arrived, this one directly from Diane. No law firm letterhead, no pretense of professionalism. It was a thick stack of lined paper filled with accusations, claiming I'd killed the meaning of family and ruined her twilight years. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in the back of my file. That evening, I made a few changes that had been sitting on my to-do list. I updated my phone number, changed mailing preferences to digital only, and replaced my emergency contact with a colleague from work. With a few clicks, every remaining link between us was gone. The silence that followed was different this time. It didn't hang in the air like tension. It settled. I realized that peace wasn't about distance or noise. It was about not being controlled anymore. A month later, while grocery shopping, I ran into Nancy, one of my mother's old friends. She greeted me warmly and said she'd seen Diane recently. Apparently, Diane was living in a modest retirement community nearby. Nancy said she kept busy with garden club meetings and occasionally joked that her daughter turned out to be the better businesswoman. There was no bitterness in her tone, just a quiet kind of amusement. It was the first time Diane's name hadn't been followed by conflict. I thanked Nancy for the update and moved on, surprised by how little it stirred in me. A few weeks later, a small package arrived at my office with no return label. Inside was a framed photograph, me and my mother at a park picnic when I was a child. On the back, written in her familiar handwriting, was one line: "I see it now. I should have built something of my own, not borrowed yours." I didn't call or write back. I set the frame on my office bookshelf beside a stack of ledgers and let it stay there. It wasn't forgiveness, just acknowledgement that understanding had finally replaced argument. That month, I signed up to volunteer with a local financial literacy program for women rebuilding their lives after divorce or financial loss. Teaching them how to manage money, document agreements, and protect their independence felt natural, like closing a loop I hadn't realized was still open. On the anniversary of buying my house, I walked through every room. The walls were freshly painted, the paperwork neatly filed, the quiet unbroken. I passed the spare room, now rented by someone who respected boundaries, and stopped by the window where I used to sit, drafting the lease that changed everything. By the time I reached the front door, evening light stretched across the floor. I turned the key in the lock, the sound sharp but final. The house didn't just belong to me on paper anymore. It belonged to the person I'd become inside it, calm, steady, and entirely self-made. I'm 30, and my mom has always believed success should be loud. The louder, the better. Growing up, our house looked more like a showroom than a home. Every corner had something meant to impress: the imported vase, the chandelier, the furniture no one was allowed to sit on. My mother, Denise, measured life by what people whispered about her at brunch. If she thought they envied her, she was happy. I never cared about that kind of thing. I work as a marketing manager, and I've always liked things simple: clean spaces, calm conversations, no need to prove anything. My dad, Robert, is more like me. He's quiet, patient, the kind of man who fixes a problem instead of talking about it. But my mom, she could turn a dinner into a competition about who raised the most successful child. I met Adam when I volunteered at a charity build for low-income housing. He ran his own small contracting business, the type of man who'd rather fix a wall himself than hire someone. He was steady, good with his hands, and never bragged. That alone made him stand out to me. After a few months, we started dating seriously, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe without pretending. The first time my mom met him, she looked him up and down and asked if he planned to stay in construction forever. It wasn't curiosity, it was judgment wrapped in politeness. She laughed it off, made a joke about him being hands-on in every sense, and the people around the table laughed too. I could see Adam's jaw tighten, but he didn't say anything. My dad gave me a small, apologetic look across the table. That became the pattern. Mom poked, Adam stayed calm, Dad diffused. 2 years passed. Adam's business grew. He started taking on renovation projects, even buying older properties to restore and resell. I got promoted at work. We were stable, happy, and planning for the future. When Adam proposed during a weekend hike, I said yes without hesitation. When I told my parents, my mom smiled too widely and said, "He's nice, but are you sure you want to limit yourself so early?" My dad congratulated us quietly. My mom immediately began talking about the engagement party she wanted to host. She booked an expensive venue and told everyone how proud she was. I overheard her whisper to a friend that I was marrying a man with potential, not results. That night, I realized her approval was something I'd been paying for since childhood, and I was finally done making the payments. Adam overheard some of it too. But instead of reacting, he told me, "People show their values when they think no one's listening." That's how he handled her, grace over confrontation. When the wedding came, she wanted a show. Adam and I decided to pay for most of it ourselves to keep control. My mom complained but went along once she saw the photos would still look expensive. She kept assuming Adam was just comfortable, not realizing he already owned multiple investment properties under his company name. After the wedding, we moved into a cozy, newly built home that Adam had designed himself. My mom called it quaint. I started shortening our visits, keeping phone calls polite but brief. I thought things might settle once she saw we were happy. But instead, she started talking about the new neighborhood she deserved to move into, a luxury area she bragged about endlessly at her luncheons. She didn't know Adam already owned a house there, a fully renovated one, the same neighborhood she dreamed of joining to prove she hadn't fallen behind. And that was the first hint that life was about to flip the script on her idea of marrying down. After the wedding, my mom's new obsession became getting into the neighborhood she'd been bragging about for months. She talked about it every time I saw her: tree-lined streets, perfect lawns, luxury cars. She said people like her belonged there. My dad stayed quiet, which was never a good sign. When I dropped by one weekend, he pulled me aside in the kitchen and told me the truth. They were deep in credit card debt, barely keeping up with their mortgage. Every dinner party, every designer piece, every showy vacation had been bought on credit. A few days later, Adam mentioned a property his company had just finished renovating, in the exact neighborhood my mom wanted. It was a modern 2-story home with new landscaping and custom woodwork. He said it would go on the market soon, listed under his company, AJ Property Group. I told him not to mention it to my mom. She'd never buy a house from her contractor's son-in-law. Adam smiled and said we should just wait and see what happened, if she discovered it herself. He listed the property quietly. The company handled the staging and open house scheduling, and within a week, the listing was up online with professional photos. My mom saw it almost immediately. She called me, thrilled, telling me she'd found a real home worth aspiring to. She insisted I come with her to the open house, even though she said the price might be out of reach for regular buyers. On the way there, she joked that maybe Adam could mow lawns in that neighborhood someday. When we arrived, the place was full of people. My mom walked through the front door like she already owned it, complimenting the light fixtures and open layout loud enough for everyone to hear. She told the realtor she loved the craftsmanship, how it felt so well built, unlike most modern homes. Then she turned a corner and saw Adam standing in the foyer wearing his company badge. Her smile froze. Adam greeted her politely, introduced himself to the group as the contractor and developer, and continued giving the tour. My mom followed silently as he explained the design choices, flooring materials, and sustainable upgrades. People listened attentively and asked questions. Robert joined in, asking about insulation and custom carpentry. My mom trailed behind, holding her purse tightly, barely speaking. When the tour ended, guests complimented the property and congratulated Adam. My mom tried to pretend she wasn't surprised, but the change in her face was clear. She left early, saying she had another appointment. On the drive home, she muttered something about how Adam must work for the company's owner. She refused to believe what she'd seen. Later that evening, my dad told me she'd been telling her friends that Adam probably just did some of the labor. We didn't correct her. We decided to let her find out on her own. Within a few weeks, word spread through her friend group. The open house photos had Adam's name listed on the permit and the company registration. One of her friends even congratulated her on having such a successful son-in-law. My mom laughed it off but couldn't hide her discomfort. Her attitude shifted almost overnight. She started inviting Adam to family dinners, asking questions about his projects, pretending she had always known he'd make it big. At first, it was almost funny watching her try to rewrite history. She began bragging to her friends that she'd encouraged him to start his business years ago. At one of these dinners, she made a big deal about the wine selection, as if we were hosting potential investors instead of family. She asked Adam for advice on remodeling their kitchen, and he answered her politely without any smugness. My dad sat quietly, clearly impressed by how calmly Adam handled everything. As weeks passed, my mom's tone changed from superiority to careful politeness. She asked Adam's opinion on things she used to mock him for. She even started talking about helping him network with some of her friends. But the power dynamic had already shifted. Everyone around her could see it. At her next social gathering, she mentioned Adam's company casually, pretending she'd always been proud of him. Her friends didn't correct her, they just smiled knowingly. For once, she wasn't leading the conversation. She was following it. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. She had spent years trying to prove that appearance mattered more than character. Now the same appearances she worshipped were working against her. By the end of that month, every time someone praised Adam's success, she'd nod and act as though it was part of her plan all along. But when no one was looking, she'd glance at him with that mix of pride and resentment only someone like her could balance. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was the one chasing her approval. She was the one trying to earn ours. After the open house, my mom reinvented herself overnight. The same woman who once called Adam too blue-collar started calling him visionary. She told everyone she'd always seen his potential, and even claimed she used to motivate him to think bigger. Every time she spoke, it sounded like she was rewriting history in real time. At family gatherings, she talked about how she had guided us when we were first married. She'd tell stories that never happened, like how she advised Adam on his business name or encouraged him to expand into property development. My dad would stay quiet, sometimes rubbing the back of his neck, trying not to react. In private, though, nothing had changed. Whenever I visited her alone, she'd find a way to belittle me. She'd glance at my clothes, comment on my work hours, and say things like, "You're lucky Adam finally took off when he did." It wasn't even subtle. I just learned not to respond. At a family barbecue one weekend, she held court at the table, telling everyone that Adam's business was thriving because of her early encouragement. She made it sound like she'd been his mentor. People smiled politely, most of them already knowing the real story. My dad tried to change the subject twice, but she was too busy enjoying the attention. After that day, Adam started keeping his distance. He was polite, always calm, but he made fewer visits. Whenever my mom invited us over, he'd say he was working late or managing a new project. It wasn't spiteful, it was just a quiet line drawn. She didn't argue with it, probably too aware that pushing might backfire. A few weeks later, she started trying to involve herself in his work. She'd send texts asking for input on design choices or color palettes, pretending she was just being supportive. Once, she even showed up at a renovation site uninvited, carrying magazines and pointing out trends she thought would elevate the design. Adam thanked her for stopping by, then made sure his team didn't take direction from her again. The real trouble started when she attended a networking event where one of Adam's major clients was present. She told the client's project manager that she'd helped him choose the interior tones for a new build, claiming she had an eye for modern taste. The project manager looked confused, and word eventually got back to Adam. He handled it without confrontation. He reached out to the client directly, clarified everything professionally, and the issue was resolved before it could become a problem. He never mentioned it to her again, but after that he started avoiding any event where she'd be present. I took a different approach. I started posting small things online about Adam's recent work, community awards, charity builds, and the eco-friendly projects he sponsored. My mom saw them through mutual friends. Every time she did, she'd call to compliment him while slipping in complaints about how her own kitchen felt too modest or how her living room needed a facelift. That's when she started comparing herself to Adam's clients. She'd drive through neighborhoods where his houses stood and talk about how she could have decorated them better. It wasn't long before she became fixated again on the same luxury area where the open house happened. Then came the twist neither of us saw coming. Adam got a call from a real estate developer offering to buy that exact house, the one my mom had once bragged she'd move into someday. The developer said a private buyer wanted it immediately. No negotiation needed. The offer was well above market price. When the paperwork came through, the buyer's name caught my attention. It was my mom's longtime rival, Elaine, a woman she'd been trying to outshine for decades. They used to host dueling dinner parties, each trying to impress the same social circle. Elaine had always been the one step ahead, the one who got the last word. Adam sold the house for a record profit. A few weeks later, local real estate blogs featured the property and praised his design work. Photos of the home spread quickly, especially because Elaine hosted a small charity gathering there, tagging Adam's company in the posts. When my mom saw the pictures, she nearly dropped her phone. She complained for days that Adam should have given family first chance, pretending that she had somehow been cheated out of something that was never hers. She called it unfair, saying it would have been nice to have that house in the family. The next time I saw her, she brought it up again over dinner. I didn't raise my voice or argue. I just told her that Adam only sells to people who value his work. She didn't respond right away, just stared at her plate, clearly unsure how to answer that. After that, she grew quieter around us. Not polite, just calculating. She started dropping hints about wanting to host something special soon, saying she had plans to show people she still had taste. I knew what that meant. She was going to try to repair her image, the only way she knew how, by performing for it. She began making calls, reserving vendors, hinting about a grand event she was organizing. My dad didn't say much, but the look on his face told me he'd already seen this cycle before. And just like every time my mom tried to prove something, she was setting herself up for another spectacular fall. Only this time, the audience would be much larger, and she'd be the one writing her own downfall without even realizing it. It started with a phone call from my dad. He told me my mom was planning something big, and that it might be better if I heard it from him first. She was throwing what she called a garden soiree, a fancy outdoor party to remind people what elegance looks like. The gossip about Adam's success and her rival buying his property had apparently spread through her circle, and she wanted to reclaim her narrative. When I asked how she was paying for it, my dad hesitated. He finally admitted she'd taken out another credit card. The caterers, the string lights, the floral arches, all rented. She'd even booked a professional photographer. He didn't know how much she'd spent, only that it was more than they could cover. Adam wasn't surprised when I told him. He just said, "Let her have her moment. It might end itself." Against my better judgment, I agreed to attend. On the day of the party, her backyard looked like a rented version of a magazine cover. A fountain bubbled in the center, surrounded by fresh flowers that clearly hadn't come from her garden. White chairs and tables were arranged in perfect lines, and there were fairy lights draped across the fence. It looked beautiful at first glance, but when Adam helped run a few power cords, he found half the outlets taped together with electrical tape. He quietly fixed them before guests arrived. By sunset, cars started lining the street. My mom floated from guest to guest in a sequin dress, calling the evening her celebration of family success. She made sure everyone knew Adam would be there, and hinted that his business had benefited from her early advice. Every time someone mentioned his projects, she redirected the conversation toward herself. My dad stood near the buffet, keeping his distance. As the night went on, small groups began exchanging looks. Several of the guests knew exactly who Adam was and what his company did. My mom didn't. She was too busy taking credit for his taste, saying his design sense came from her refined influence. One woman near me smirked and whispered that my mom had no idea she was only digging herself deeper. Then came the moment that cracked the performance. While serving drinks, a caterer mentioned how they'd just worked another event at the stunning property by AJ Property Group. A few heads turned. One of the guests asked if that was the same company owned by Adam, and when he nodded politely, the realization spread fast. Compliments started rolling in about his craftsmanship, the open house, even the article that had run about it. My mom's expression barely held. Trying to steer the attention back, she announced a special presentation. A projector screen lit up behind her with a slideshow titled Our Family Milestones. The first few photos were harmless, vacations, old holidays, but then it became obvious that most of the pictures were just of her, posing at social events. Guests glanced around awkwardly. Halfway through, the slideshow froze. My mom clicked the remote repeatedly, until suddenly, her phone notifications mirrored on the screen. A string of unsent messages appeared. Drafts she must have typed earlier that week. They weren't flattering. One said, "Can you believe Lily settled for a handyman?" Another called me lucky Adam made something of himself. The crowd went silent. My mom fumbled with the remote, but every click made it worse. A few guests whispered, and one of her closest friends quietly turned away. The air was thick with embarrassment. Adam stepped forward without saying a word. He walked up to the projector, disconnected it, and said, calm as ever, "Thanks for coming, it's been a lovely evening." He smiled, shook a few hands, and started helping clear the tables. His tone didn't carry an ounce of anger, which somehow made it more powerful. Guests began leaving in a quiet wave. My mom tried to laugh it off, saying it was a technical glitch. My dad stood by the gate, holding the car keys, face unreadable. When the last person left, my mom muttered that I must have tampered with her phone. My dad didn't respond. Later that night, on the drive home, he finally spoke. He told her she'd turned admiration into mockery, and that she was the only one who didn't realize she'd been the target of her own show. She didn't answer him. By the next morning, the photos from the soiree had started circulating in her friend group, none of them flattering. The whispers she'd been trying to escape turned sharper. A few people who used to invite her to luncheons stopped calling altogether. She told everyone I had sabotaged her presentation, but no one believed her. The story of her messages had already made its way around, and people remembered how she used to talk about Adam before he became successful. By the end of the week, her calendar was empty. No calls, no invitations, no brunches. All the people she had spent years trying to impress suddenly found excuses to stay away. It took one night, one slideshow, and a few lines of her own words to dismantle everything she'd built. And this time, no amount of pretending could fix it. Within a few weeks of the garden party, my mom's social calendar cleared itself. Her friends stopped calling, one by one. The same women she used to gossip with suddenly had schedule conflicts. The group chats she used to lead went silent. She told the neighbors she was focusing on private projects, pretending she'd chosen to step away from society. But everyone in town already knew what happened. The messages from that slideshow had become the punchline of quiet conversations. While she tried to act busy, my dad started spending more time at our house. He'd stop by on weekends, sometimes helping Adam in the workshop or joining us for dinner. He said it was peaceful at our place, which told me everything about what it was like back at his. My mom barely noticed his absences, at least she pretended not to. The irony was that the disaster she caused ended up working in Adam's favor. People remembered how calm he'd been that night, how he handled her outburst with grace instead of anger. His reputation in real estate grew faster than ever. Clients called him precisely because they trusted the man who could keep his cool under pressure. The story of the contractor who stayed classy when chaos hit made its rounds, and he landed 2 new contracts from referrals that came directly after that party. At work, I had my own turning point. My company launched a campaign centered around authenticity and substance over image. I led the project, drawing a lot from what I'd learned watching my mom's world crumble from surface-level vanity. The campaign went viral locally, and within a month, I was promoted. It was poetic. In a way, the exact values my mother ignored had built my success. When she heard about it, she called to congratulate me. Then, within the same breath, she told one of her friends that Adam must be riding my success. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Her words had stopped carrying weight. Not long after, she started trying to involve herself again. She suggested that Adam and I upgrade our address now that we were doing well, claiming we should live somewhere that reflected our achievements. She hinted that she could help with interior design since her taste was timeless. I told her as calmly as possible that we'd already bought a second property, a quiet home outside the city with a guest suite. My dad's eyes lit up when he heard. He joked that it might become his retreat once Mom started hosting luncheons again. She didn't laugh. Watching him bond with Adam seemed to bother her more than she'd admit. She started finding reasons to bring up how ungrateful we'd been, or how she was just trying to guide us. The more my dad relaxed around us, the more she seemed to tighten her grip on her image at home. A few weeks later, Adam suggested we invite them both for dinner at the new house. He said it would be better to show her what peace looked like instead of explaining it. I agreed. We kept things simple. A home-cooked meal, soft lighting, no showpieces or catering. The table was small but warm, the kind of space that encouraged conversation instead of competition. When they arrived, my mom's expression said it all. She scanned the house, probably looking for signs of wealth to measure against her own. The place wasn't flashy, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Wood beams, open light, quiet order. She complimented it half-heartedly, glancing at Adam as if waiting for him to brag. He didn't. He poured her a glass of water, offered her a seat, and went back to finishing dinner. The evening flowed easily. My dad and Adam talked about woodworking and gardening. I shared updates from work. There was laughter, no tension, no pretending. My mom kept glancing around the room, studying how comfortable everyone seemed. When my dad complimented the setup, she blurted that she could host better if given the chance. He looked at her and said quietly, "Maybe start by enjoying instead of competing." It wasn't cruel, it was tired honesty. The table fell silent for a moment. Then Adam spoke, not to argue, just to fill the air. He mentioned that every part of the house had been built slowly, one project at a time. "Patience pays more than pride," he said while setting down the serving bowl. My mom didn't reply. She stared at the table for a long moment, then changed the subject to something harmless. The night ended politely, but something had shifted. When they left, my dad hugged us both. My mom lingered at the door, her eyes scanning the space one last time as if trying to understand what made it feel so steady. Over the next week, she barely called. My dad still visited often, bringing fresh bread or vegetables from the market. He looked lighter each time. My mom, meanwhile, told neighbors she was working on personal growth, though everyone could tell she didn't know what that meant. The truth was simple. Her power came from pretending she was above others. Once that illusion cracked, she didn't know how to stand it all. For the first time, silence had replaced her constant need for attention, and she didn't know how to fill it. By November, my mom decided she needed to get back on her feet. The whispers about the party still followed her, so she planned a home renovation before the holidays. She told everyone it was time to modernize her house. What she didn't mention was that she'd taken out a small personal loan to fund it. She hired a contractor, ordered high-end fixtures, and boasted that her new look would put the neighborhood back in awe. It didn't take long for things to fall apart. Material prices jumped halfway through, and her payments started lagging. The workers stopped showing up after a few weeks. When I visited, the living room walls were stripped bare, and wires hung out of open outlets. The house looked like a construction site, not a home. My dad met me at the door and quietly told me the truth. The project was stalled, and the loan company was calling daily. He asked me not to bring it up to her. She'd been insisting everything was under control. But a few days later, I saw her arguing on the phone with the supplier about unpaid invoices. The moment she noticed me, she forced a smile and changed the topic to holiday recipes. When I visited again a week later, the house was worse. There were half-installed cabinets in the kitchen, no proper flooring, and a thin layer of dust over everything. My dad finally came to our house one evening looking exhausted. He admitted he was worried they'd lose the home if the bank stepped in. My mom had already tried refinancing, but the delay triggered warning notices. Adam listened quietly, then asked for a copy of the paperwork. The next morning, he made a few calls. By the end of the week, he had arranged to buy the property through his company. He didn't announce it or make a big deal. He just told my dad that they could stay there temporarily while his crew finished the renovation. My dad agreed immediately. When my mom found out, she exploded. She accused me of scheming to take over her life, shouting that we'd humiliated her by buying her home out from under her. My dad didn't let it slide this time. He told her, calm but firm, that ownership wasn't the problem. Ingratitude was. For the first time, she went quiet. Adam's team moved in the next day and began restoring the place properly. They repaired the wiring, finished the floors, and repainted every room. Slowly, the house transformed into a bright, modern space. Neighbors started stopping by to compliment the design, saying it looked like something out of a magazine. Even the local real estate column featured it under a restored classic, naming Adam's company in the byline. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same home she'd nearly lost trying to impress people now stood as one of the best-looking properties on the block, thanks to the man she'd once mocked for being too ordinary. I visited one afternoon while the crew was finishing up. My mom was sitting by the window, watching the workers install the final fixtures. For the first time in years, she looked still. When Adam arrived to check the final inspection, she stood and thanked him softly. It wasn't dramatic, just quiet, almost awkward, but it was real. Adam nodded and said he was glad it was finally being appreciated. A week later, the renovation was complete. Adam listed the house and sold it quickly to a young family who fell in love with the craftsmanship. My dad used part of the profit to buy a smaller debt-free cottage outside town. He said it felt good to live somewhere peaceful. My mom moved with him, though it was clear she struggled with the change. Their new place was modest, clean, quiet, nothing flashy. Every week, when she drove into town for errands, she passed her old house. The new owners had kept the garden simple but added a brass plaque by the front gate with Adam's company name engraved beneath the title, "Restored with Integrity." Neighbors told me she slows down every time she drives past it. She doesn't stop or make excuses anymore. She just looks. It's strange how things came full circle. She spent years chasing admiration, and the only thing that earned her any respect in the end was someone else's humility. Months passed quietly after Adam sold my mother's former house. Life found a steady rhythm again. Adam's projects were booked months in advance, and I focused on a new client campaign at work. My dad started visiting often, sometimes to help Adam build a garden shed, other times just to share dinner and sit by the fire. He said our home felt peaceful, and he stayed late most evenings, only leaving when it got dark. My mom didn't visit. Her phone hardly rang anymore. The women she used to lunch with had stopped including her in their plans. The gossip that once fed her sense of importance had gone silent. She spent most of her days alone in their small cottage, surrounded by designer furniture that looked out of place in the quiet space. One afternoon, she went through her desk drawers looking for an old receipt, and found years of bills and statements instead. Membership renewals for clubs she never attended, invoices for decorations used once, deposits for parties that had never happened. Every page showed money she didn't have, spent trying to keep up an image no one cared about anymore. That night, my dad stopped by her place on his way home. He told her he'd been helping Adam with a new project and invited her to come along next time. She waved him off. Before he left, he told her gently that she'd spent her life trying to make people look up to her when the ones who cared were already beside her. The words stayed with her long after he drove away. A week later, I sent a short message to both of them, inviting them to dinner. My dad replied immediately with a thumbs up. My mom didn't answer at first. Then, late that night, she wrote, "I'll come." She almost backed out twice that day. My dad later told me she changed outfits 3 times before finally choosing a simple sweater and plain earrings, something she hadn't done in years. When she arrived, she hesitated on the porch, looking unsure whether she should knock or just walk in. Adam opened the door before she decided. The house was calm. The dining table was set simply. White plates, soft candles, a homemade casserole baking in the oven. No catering trays, no background chatter, no need for performance. My dad settled into conversation easily, asking Adam about his latest build. My mom stayed quiet at first, glancing around like she was still waiting for someone to start competing. Then something changed. The air stayed light, laughter came naturally, and the quiet between words didn't feel tense. She watched Adam and me move around the kitchen, refilling glasses, passing food, finishing each other's tasks with ease. It wasn't planned or rehearsed. It was just comfortable. After dinner, my dad lifted his glass. He toasted to learning what lasts longer than pride. His tone wasn't pointed, just warm. For once, no one looked away. My mom set down her fork and said softly that she'd misjudged Adam and spent too long chasing things that didn't matter. She didn't apologize outright, but her words didn't need dressing up. They were plain and clear. I thanked her for saying it, explaining that trust doesn't rebuild through speeches, only through consistency. Adam nodded, keeping the moment grounded. When they stood to leave, my mom paused by the hallway table. A framed photo sat there, one of the 3 of us standing in front of the restored home she used to brag about. Beside it was a small plaque that read, "Built with honesty." She didn't say anything, just looked at it for a long moment before heading toward the door. The ride home was quiet, according to my dad. He later told me she looked out the window most of the way, then said quietly that she'd spent her whole life trying to build respect when all she'd really done was chase attention. Months later, word got around that she had started volunteering at a community center downtown. She helped families plan budget-friendly home projects and taught basic organization to new homeowners. When someone thanked her, she didn't respond with stories about herself anymore, just smiled and handed them a brochure. Sometimes she'd drive past one of Adam's completed houses on her way home. She never stopped or took pictures, but my dad said she always slowed down, just enough to take a long look before driving on. The house she once called beneath her had become a quiet reminder of everything she'd misunderstood, and everything she finally started to learn. I'm 31, and for the last 8 years, I've been the operations manager at my family's event planning company. My parents started it years ago, and when my older sister Brooke joined, they decided we should run it together. Brooke handled clients and publicity, while I managed logistics, contracts, and finances. On paper, it sounded balanced. In reality, Brooke got the spotlight, and I kept the business from collapsing behind the scenes. Brooke has always had this charm that wins people over instantly. She could walk into a room and leave with 5 new clients and 3 free drinks. Clients loved her energy, and my parents worshipped her creativity. The problem was, she also spent money like it grew on trees. Every event had to be bigger and better. Floral arches from Paris. Imported lighting from Italy. I'd end up cutting corners elsewhere just to keep our profit margins alive. It started small. A few missing invoices here, a few mismatched numbers there. I'd noticed vendor payments listed as consultation fees under her name, but when I asked about them, she'd wave it off, saying they were for creative brainstorming sessions. When I brought my concerns to our parents, they brushed me off. "You know your sister," my dad said. "She just does things differently." My mom told me to trust Brooke's instincts, as if my degree in business management counted for nothing. Then we landed a massive contract, a corporate gala for one of the biggest tech firms in the region. It was supposed to be our breakthrough moment, something that could take us from local reputation to national recognition. Brooke was ecstatic. She called it her baby, even though I handled every contract, every supplier, every deposit. She only appeared for the press photos. A few days before the event, while checking the company account, I noticed several large withdrawals labeled as networking costs. The amounts were too high to ignore. When I asked Brooke, she told me she was building relationships and buying pre-event gifts for VIP guests. It sounded suspicious, but I let it go. The event was too close, and I didn't want to start a war right before the biggest night of our careers. The gala turned out flawless. The venue looked like something out of a luxury magazine. The client was thrilled, the press coverage was glowing, and every article featured Brooke's smiling face with captions about her visionary leadership. My parents were proud of her, specifically. No one mentioned who negotiated every vendor contract or fixed the logistical disasters behind the scenes. I didn't mind the lack of attention, but something in my gut said I should double-check the books. During the quarterly review, my accountant flagged several unexplained payments to vendors he'd never heard of. The names didn't match any of our usual partners. When I cross-referenced the transactions, the addresses didn't exist. I brought it up during a team review, and Brooke immediately turned it around on me. She accused me of carelessness, claiming I must have made accounting mistakes. Our parents believed her without hesitation. My mom even said, "Lauren, your sister has been working so hard. Don't ruin this with paranoia." That was the moment I realized I was on my own. From then on, I stopped arguing and started watching. I copied invoices, downloaded bank statements, and saved receipts to a private folder on my laptop. I didn't know exactly what I'd find, but I knew there was a trail. A few weeks later, a vendor emailed me directly. They sent a polite reminder about a payment they'd been waiting on, one I had personally processed weeks earlier. I checked the transaction ID. The payment had gone through, but not to their account. The funds had been redirected somewhere else entirely. I remember staring at that email for a long time. It wasn't a mistake. It was theft. Brooke wasn't just being creative with money, she was stealing it. And for the first time, I understood that the family business I'd spent years protecting was nothing more than a cover for her greed. I decided then that I'd expose her, even if it meant tearing down everything my family thought they'd built. The next morning, I went through every transaction from the last 6 months. It was like peeling back layers of rot I didn't want to see. The same amounts kept showing up. Round numbers, identical entries marked as vendor reimbursements. The names looked legitimate at first glance, but the formatting was slightly off. Some had extra letters, some used abbreviations I'd never seen before. I pulled up the company's vendor database and realized none of these businesses actually existed. One name stood out, D. Harper Logistics. I typed it into our internal system. Nothing. When I checked the bank account linked to it, my stomach tightened. The account was registered under Derek Harper, Brooke's boyfriend. The same Derek who had been unemployed for most of last year, now somehow living in a high-rise apartment and posting pictures of weekend getaways. I went line by line, tracing each fake invoice. 5 payments, all processed through Brooke's approval chain, totaling over $20,000. Every one of them ended up in Derek's account. It wasn't sloppy bookkeeping, it was deliberate. I called my accountant and asked to meet privately outside the office. We met at a small cafe near his firm. I showed him the records, and his expression tightened as he scrolled through my laptop. He explained how to preserve digital proof, download full bank statements directly from the bank's portal, save every file with timestamps, and print duplicates for a paper trail. He also warned me not to delete or edit anything on the shared database. Any changes could make it look like I was tampering with records. That night, I stayed late at the office, downloading every statement, invoice, and approval log I could find. I copied them onto a personal drive and backed them up in the cloud. Every file was labeled, dated, and sorted. I didn't know when I'd need it, but I wanted everything airtight. By the end of the week, Brooke rolled into the parking lot in a brand new white SUV. She made sure everyone saw it. The staff gathered around, congratulating her on the promotion bonus. She laughed and said, "Hard work pays off." Meanwhile, I was on the phone with 2 vendors asking why their checks had bounced. Our company account had just enough to cover payroll, but not the smaller invoices. I called the bank first, hoping to stop any more outgoing transfers. The representative told me that since Brooke was a co-signatory, I couldn't freeze or alter payment permissions without board authorization. In our case, board meant my parents, both of whom worshipped Brooke's confidence like it was the backbone of the company. I went home that evening and gathered every document I had. The next morning, I met with my parents at the office. My dad looked irritated before I even started talking. I explained the issue calmly: unauthorized transfers, fake vendors, Derek's name on the accounts. He didn't even look at the papers I brought. He said I was overreacting, that I'd always been jealous of my sister's natural business instincts. My mother nodded in agreement, saying Brooke just handled things differently. When I tried to insist, my dad cut me off and told me not to stir up trouble in the middle of a busy quarter. Later that evening, Brooke came into my office. She closed the door and leaned against the wall with that same self-satisfied grin she always wore when she got her way. She told me to drop it and added, "Family forgives everything." It wasn't advice, it was a warning. 2 days later, I started getting emails from vendors about late payments. Brooke had forwarded them to our parents, attaching a note implying that I'd been careless with the bookkeeping. My father sent me a one-line message: "Fix this mess immediately." That's when I realized she was turning everyone against me before I even made a move. By the end of that week, our reputation started to take a hit. Vendors I'd worked with for years suddenly sounded cold on the phone. One even hinted that they might pull out of future contracts. I knew Brooke was spreading her version of the story, painting me as incompetent while she played the savior. I spent that weekend printing everything: financial statements, email chains, vendor messages, and labeling them by date. I even printed copies of Derek's bank registration under the company vendor list. When my living room started looking like a filing room, I decided it was time to take professional advice. My accountant referred me to a small business attorney he trusted. I met her on a Wednesday morning and handed over a folder with everything I'd gathered. She flipped through it quietly, stopping at the fake invoices and the cross-linked bank accounts. When she finally looked up, she said I had enough to prove internal fraud. But she also warned me what it meant. Once I acted, it would tear the family apart. For the next few days, I went through every possible scenario in my head. If I stayed quiet, I'd be complicit. If I spoke up, I'd destroy the business my parents built. It wasn't an easy decision, but it became clear that silence was no longer an option. So I decided to keep collecting proof until there was no possible way to twist the truth. No emotional manipulation, no excuses, just facts. Because the next time I confronted Brooke, I wasn't going to let her hide behind family again. One morning I got to the office before anyone else. The lights were still off and the air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. Brooke's laptop sat open on her desk, the screen still glowing from the night before. Normally I wouldn't touch it, but after weeks of digging and watching her twist the truth, I decided to check one thing before I made my next move. I navigated through her folders, and that's when I saw it, a hidden one labeled Client Retainers. It looked innocent, but inside were dozens of files, all with similar names and dates that lined up with the fake payments I'd already traced. I opened one and felt the pattern click into place. The invoice looked professional, almost identical to the templates we used for legitimate vendors. But in the corner, where the vendor address should have been, was Derek's apartment. Every file followed the same pattern, same font, same logo style, just different amounts and fake names. I copied everything onto a flash drive, then emailed encrypted backups to myself and stored them on a private cloud account. I printed hard copies too, labeling each by date. If Brooke or my parents ever tried to accuse me of manipulation, I'd have physical evidence. I even left the files untouched on her laptop. No signs of access, no modified timestamps. To be sure, I called one of the supposed vendors listed on a consulting invoice. The number was a real company that did event logistics. But when I asked about the project name, the manager said they'd never worked with us. That confirmed it. This wasn't bad bookkeeping, it was deliberate theft. By noon, I had enough evidence to connect every missing dollar to Derek. The fraud totaled over $40,000 across multiple accounts. I contacted my lawyer and asked how to proceed. She told me it was time for a formal confrontation. I scheduled a meeting for the following morning and asked my parents and Brooke to attend. My dad assumed it was a quarterly update. Brooke showed up late, coffee in hand, as if it were just another routine catch-up. I walked in carrying 3 folders, one for each of them. I started with the basics. I laid out the statements, matched every payment to its supposed vendor, then showed the corresponding deposits into Derek's account. At first, no one spoke. My dad stared at the papers like they were in another language. My mom blinked fast, as if she could unsee it. Brooke finally broke the silence, claiming she'd only loaned Derek the money to help him get on his feet and planned to replace it. My father's face turned red, but not from anger, fear. He kept muttering about damage control and how the company's reputation couldn't survive a scandal. My mother said we could sort it out quietly. Brooke tried to cry her way through the meeting, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. That was the moment I stopped playing along. I told them they had 2 options: either report the fraud and restructure the business immediately, or I'd resign and take the documentation to law enforcement. My dad slammed his hand on the table and said family comes first. Brooke started crying harder, repeating that same phrase she always used: family should forgive everything. No one said anything after that. The room was silent except for the sound of the printer still running in the background. I slid my resignation letter across the table and walked out. My mom followed me to the hallway, whispering about keeping things quiet, but I didn't stop walking. That afternoon, I sent digital copies of all evidence to our accountant with a note saying it should be preserved for the company's audit file. I also gave my lawyer permission to hold everything on record. I knew what would come next: the fallout, the blame, the silence. When I left the office, the parking lot was empty except for Brooke's new SUV gleaming under the sun. A few months ago, that car had been her trophy. Now it looked like a warning sign. I didn't go home right away. I sat in my car for a few minutes, scrolling through the emails I'd backed up, each one a breadcrumb leading to the truth no one wanted to admit. My family had built an entire business on the idea that love and loyalty could fix anything. But now, standing outside that building, I knew the truth. Forgiveness had turned into permission. That day marked the first time I didn't step back for their comfort. I walked away for good, and this time, the consequences wouldn't disappear behind family dinners and empty apologies. After I left the company, I started from scratch. I registered my own small event consultancy under my name and set up a desk in my apartment. The first few weeks were quiet, but then vendors I'd worked with for years began calling. They were tired of chasing unpaid invoices from my family's company and wanted to know if I was still working independently. By the end of the month, I'd signed my first solo contract, a mid-sized corporate retreat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Meanwhile, word started spreading. Clients who'd done business with us before began pulling out of future events. Some mentioned rumors about missing deposits and refund delays. I didn't have to guess where those came from. Brooke and my parents were still pretending nothing was wrong, but the cracks were showing. One afternoon, a vendor I trusted forwarded me a screenshot from a group chat among local suppliers. It showed Derek bragging to a former coworker about easy money from a company his girlfriend helped run. He'd even sent a picture of Brooke's SUV, captioned with a joke about upgrades. The timestamp on the messages matched the same period I'd discovered the stolen payments. I forwarded everything to my lawyer, who added the messages to my evidence file. She told me it was enough to trigger a review by state auditors if I submitted a report. I didn't do it immediately. Instead, I watched from the sidelines as the damage kept spreading. Within a few weeks, several corporate clients began threatening legal action unless they received refunds. I heard from an old colleague that 2 major contracts had already been canceled. When I checked public records, I saw the company had filed a temporary suspension of operations. It meant their accounts were likely frozen. Then my father called for the first time since the day I quit. He told me the company was in trouble and asked me to help clean up the mess. He framed it as a favor to the family, not an apology. When I told him I had warned them, he accused me of abandoning them when things got hard. After that call, my lawyer advised me to protect myself legally. We drafted an affidavit confirming my resignation date, the reason for it, and the evidence I'd turned over before leaving. She submitted it to the Department of Revenue in case the investigation reached me. 2 weeks later, it did. An auditor contacted me for a statement. They had received multiple client complaints about missing funds and misappropriated deposits. I provided my documents and confirmed that the financial irregularities I'd flagged happened before and after my resignation. The auditor thanked me and said my cooperation would help separate my name from the fraud investigation. Within days, the company's accounts were officially frozen. A notice went out to all partners stating that operations were suspended pending review. Vendors who hadn't been paid started talking publicly, and local news sites picked up the story. Not long after, my mother sent me a short email asking if I was satisfied now that the family name was being dragged through the mud. I didn't reply, but a few hours later, I received another message from an employee still at the company. She said half the staff had quit, and Brooke had been showing up late or not at all. The same night, another vendor called me privately. He said Brooke had tried to convince him to delete invoices and reissue new ones with different dates. He refused and forwarded me the email. My lawyer added it to the file and told me it was evidence of ongoing obstruction. By the end of the month, the Department of Revenue announced a formal audit of the company's books. They requested complete access to all banking transactions, vendor contracts, and communications. My parents were forced to cooperate. From what I later heard, they tried to downplay Brooke's role, claiming it was clerical confusion. But the auditors already had enough proof to know better. When I checked the company's registration portal a week later, the business status showed frozen, pending financial review. It meant no one could withdraw, deposit, or process any transactions without government oversight. Brooke's signature authority was revoked immediately. While all this was unfolding, my own business started gaining traction. Several former clients reached out, saying they respected how I'd handled the fallout. One even hired me to plan their next event. It was surreal watching everything collapse from the outside, while quietly rebuilding something stable on my own. About a month later, my father called again. His voice sounded smaller this time. He said they were going through a difficult phase, and asked if I'd consider returning, just to fix the numbers. I told him I no longer had access to any of their systems, and reminded him of the last time I'd tried to warn them. He hung up without another word. That same evening, I received a formal email from the auditing department, confirming my cooperation, and clarifying that I was not a person of interest in the ongoing investigation. It was official, I was out of it. From then on, everything moved fast. The company's license was temporarily suspended. Vendors filed claims, clients demanded refunds, and Brooke, the person who once believed she could twist anything into forgiveness, was now facing the one thing she couldn't charm her way out of: accountability. That was the moment I realized the balance had shifted. For the first time, I didn't have to fight to be heard. The truth was finally doing the work for me. The next call came early in the morning. My mother's voice was shaking. She said the company's accounts had been locked and no one had been paid. Payroll, vendors, even utilities. Everything was frozen. She asked if I could help before the family loses everything. She insisted Brooke hadn't meant to hurt anyone and that it all just got out of hand. I told her I couldn't undo what Brooke had done. Forgiveness doesn't balance accounts or reopen bank systems. My silence would only make me part of it. That afternoon, I started receiving forwarded emails from old contacts. Brooke had been messaging everyone, accusing me of creating chaos by taking confidential company files when I resigned. It was a clear attempt to shift blame. I forwarded everything to my lawyer. Within hours, she drafted a formal response, stating that all materials I had taken were legally mine for personal protection, and confirmed that nothing was deleted or misused. The letter was sent to the company's attorney and copied to the audit office handling the investigation. By the end of that week, multiple vendors had filed lawsuits for unpaid balances. A local newspaper ran an article about a family-run event company under temporary shutdown pending financial review. The headline included my family's last name. My mother called again, crying this time, saying the neighbors were asking questions. A few days later, my father called asking for a meeting at their house. He said it was time the family talked like adults. I agreed, mostly to make sure there was no more rewriting of the truth. When I arrived, the house was quieter than I'd ever heard it. My parents sat in the living room, papers spread across the coffee table. Brooke came in a few minutes later, looking like she hadn't slept in days. She said everything could have been fixed privately if I hadn't gone to a lawyer. I stayed quiet and waited. My father finally spoke. He admitted the company was finished. They had mortgaged the house to cover refunds and still couldn't meet payments. He looked exhausted. My mother avoided eye contact. I laid out the folder I'd brought with me. A simple summary. Each stolen payment matched to deposits into Derek's account, all under Brooke's name. There was no guessing left. Brooke tried to deny it, then claimed she'd only been borrowing. My father asked if there was any way to make this right. I told him the only right thing now was to stop covering for her. That ended the discussion. I stood up and told them I wouldn't be part of any cover-up or quiet payoff. I had done my share of protecting, and it had only buried them deeper. 2 days later, my lawyer called. One of the defrauded vendors had filed a police report naming Brooke as the responsible party. A formal investigation was opened, and subpoenas were issued for bank statements and communication logs. My mother called again, panicked. Brooke had disappeared. She wasn't answering calls, and creditors had started contacting my parents directly. Collection letters began arriving at their home, one after another. Within a week, local news updated the story. The investigation had officially turned criminal. Derek's name surfaced as a person of interest, but no one could find him either. For the first time, the story wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It was everywhere. News articles, online business forums, even social circles that once praised Brooke's leadership. The next time my father called, there was no anger in his voice, only resignation. He said they understood now what I'd meant when I warned them. They had spent years excusing Brooke's behavior, and now the entire family was paying for it. That was when I knew the illusion was finally broken. Forgiveness had always been their excuse to avoid accountability. Now they couldn't avoid it anymore. Investigators began their work within a few months once the case became official. Subpoenas were issued for every company record, and both my former accountant and I were called in for interviews. We provided digital copies of all the files I had collected months earlier: bank statements, vendor invoices, approval logs, and the emails showing how Brooke disguised payments under Derek's name. The lead investigator told me it was one of the most organized internal fraud cases they'd seen in a family business. Within days, the story went public. Local newspapers ran headlines about embezzlement inside a family-run event firm. The article described how funds meant for client deposits and vendor payments had been redirected to personal accounts. They didn't name Brooke directly at first, but it didn't take long for people to connect the dots. Our family name was in the article's title. The fallout was immediate. Longtime family friends stopped returning calls. Clients who used to attend our holiday parties canceled their RSVPs. My parents' social circle, which had always revolved around appearances and connections, started to crumble. They couldn't go out without whispers following them. My father resigned from a community board he'd been part of for years. My mother deleted her social media pages completely. As the investigation deepened, new details surfaced. Derek had vanished. Investigators discovered he'd emptied the joint accounts he shared with Brooke and left the state 2 weeks before the first police report was filed. He had withdrawn almost everything in cash shortly before disappearing, leaving Brooke to face the fallout alone. His last known address was an apartment under a false lease name. When authorities checked, the unit was empty. Brooke was left to face the full weight of the charges alone. 2 months after the audit began, Brooke was found hiding in a small rental house outside the city. Derek's former landlord recognized her picture from the news and tipped off investigators. She was arrested quietly early in the morning. Her car was parked out front, registration expired, plates from another vehicle. News of her arrest hit the local paper the same afternoon. The article described her as a co-owner accused of orchestrating false vendor payments to embezzle company funds. My parents were shattered. My mother refused to leave the house. My father tried to reach me several times before finally showing up at my office, asking if there was any way to stop the story from spreading further. But it was too late. The case had already entered public records. A week later, my mother called and asked if I would help pay Brooke's bail. She said, "You can't let her life end this way." I told her Brooke's life wasn't ending. It was finally catching up with her. If there was any chance for redemption, it had to start with accountability, not another rescue. Eventually, Brooke took a plea deal. She agreed to repay a portion of the stolen funds by liquidating what remained of her assets: the SUV, jewelry, and the lease on her apartment. In exchange, she received a suspended sentence and community service. It kept her out of prison, but her professional reputation was gone. No company in the city would hire her. The business didn't survive. Once the settlement terms were finalized, the company was officially dissolved. Vendors received partial repayments through insurance and liquidation funds. Employees moved on to new jobs, and the office space was vacated within weeks. My parents sold their house to cover remaining debts and moved into a smaller home across town. When I visited for the first time, the place felt empty. No framed awards, no old company photos, just a few boxes of paperwork stacked in the corner. My father admitted they'd spent years confusing enabling with love. He said they'd believed protecting Brooke meant keeping the family together, but it had only allowed her to destroy everything around her. He asked what I thought forgiveness meant now. I told him forgiveness without change isn't love, it's surrender. He didn't argue. He just nodded and said he understood. Around that same time, my own business began to grow. Word spread that I had helped expose internal fraud ethically and professionally. Former clients reached out, offering contracts. Within a few months, I hired my first 2 employees and signed long-term deals with corporate partners who once worked with our family's firm. Industry groups that had avoided my family now invited me to conferences. A local magazine ran a short feature calling my consultancy a comeback story built on transparency. My parents eventually started coming to terms with what had happened. They still spoke to Brooke occasionally through her probation officer, but the conversations were brief and monitored. They stopped asking me to intervene. I think they finally realized that every time they tried to protect her, they ended up losing more of themselves. One evening, while visiting them, My father sat across from me at their kitchen table. The light was dim, and boxes of unpaid bills still sat stacked by the wall. He looked up and said quietly, "We finally learned." I gathered the papers he'd been sorting and placed them neatly in a box. I told him, "Then maybe forgiveness starts with understanding, not excuses." He didn't say anything back, but for the first time, there was no denial in his eyes, only acceptance. 6 months passed before anyone mentioned Brooke's case again. The court finalized the plea agreement, and she began her community service hours at a local shelter under supervision. Derek was never found. The investigators suspected he'd left the country using someone else's ID. The file stayed open but inactive. My parents stopped asking about him altogether. During that time, my consulting firm grew faster than I expected. What began as a one-person operation from my apartment turned into a small team managing regional corporate events. We rented an office downtown, signed steady clients, and finally reached stability. Some of the same companies that once dropped our family business now called me directly, asking if I could take over their contracts. Occasionally, I'd get short emails from my parents, mostly about finances or tax documents linked to the company's closure. They were brief, polite, and emotionless. I didn't reply to everyone, but I always sent what they needed. Brooke wasn't allowed to contact me directly under the plea terms, but my mother started passing messages through small talk. One day she mentioned Brooke wanted to talk things out. I told her that rebuilding trust doesn't start with words, it starts with proof of change. My mother didn't argue this time. She simply said she understood and dropped it. Eventually, my parents sold what little remained of their old assets. They moved into a smaller place outside the city. A quiet street, modest house, nothing like the big home they'd once shown off. When I visited for the first time, the silence was strange. The walls were bare except for a single family photo from years ago. My father looked older but calmer. He told me they were focusing on paying off debts and staying out of the spotlight. He also said they had started volunteering at a local business mentorship program, helping young entrepreneurs avoid the mistakes they made. For the first time, I saw them take action instead of hiding behind guilt. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to speak at a regional business ethics conference. One of the organizers said they wanted to highlight small firms that had recovered from internal fraud. I agreed, not to tell my family's story, but to talk about prevention and documentation. After the session, a few attendees came up to thank me for sharing practical advice. One even mentioned my transparency restored their faith in small business owners. Later that year, I was offered a contract to organize a national industry summit, my company's biggest project yet. We handled everything: logistics, travel coordination, sponsorships. When it ended successfully, my firm's name was printed in every event magazine in the state. It was the same type of recognition Brooke used to crave, but this time it was earned. After the conference, I used part of the profit to start a small initiative that funded workshops on internal accountability for startups. I wanted new business owners to understand how easily trust can be misused and how to protect themselves. One evening, while I was working late at my office, I received a message from my father. He said Brooke had completed her community service and was now working part-time for a catering company in another city. He mentioned she was quiet these days, trying to start fresh. I read the message twice, then archived it. A few months later, I visited my parents again. My mother was in the garden, tending to plants she'd never had time for before. My father sat on the porch, reviewing paperwork. We talked briefly about ordinary things, taxes, new neighbors, nothing heavy. Before I left, my father stopped me at the door and said, "We finally learned what forgiveness should mean." I told him it's not forgetting or pretending. It's accepting what happened and not letting it repeat. He nodded and said they understood now. That night, driving home, I passed the old building where our family business used to be. The sign was gone. A new company had moved in, repainting everything. For a moment, I thought about how much time we'd spent trying to protect something that wasn't worth saving. When I got back to my office, the lights were still on. My small team was finishing up an event proposal for another client. I looked around the room, organized, steady, built on trust, the kind of environment I'd always wanted to work in. Before leaving, I printed a copy of our upcoming contract and placed it in a folder labeled Integrity Review. It was a simple routine I'd kept since the day I rebuilt everything. The next morning, I opened my laptop and saw an email from one of the sponsors of the National Summit. They wanted to make my firm their permanent event partner. It meant stability, recognition, and independence, the three things my family's company never managed to hold on to. I accepted the offer and forwarded the good news to my accountant. He replied with one line, "Full circle." That weekend, I visited my parents again. Over dinner, my father mentioned that Brooke had reached out, asking if they thought I'd ever be open to meeting someday. My mother didn't press. I told them maybe one day, if her actions ever matched her apologies. For now, distance was peace. When I left their house, my father said quietly, "We're proud of you, Lauren." It was the first time he'd said that without conditions. Back at my office, I placed the final signed contract in my drawer and turned off the lights. I whispered to myself, family doesn't forgive everything. The right kind learns from it.